So Marvel kind of screwed themselves, and now Spider-Man is not theirs any longer when it comes to the big screen, and so I guess the question on everyone's mind is, well, why doesn't Disney just buy Spider-Man back?
Tell him anyway!
Stick it on him!
Well, it's both complicated and simple, but to use the art of reduction, they can't, and they won't. See, this story starts, well, actually, I think it's best to provide the most incredible bit of context first. Sony almost had the rights to Thor, Iron Man, Black Panther, Ant-Man, and more for so little money it's actually kind of humorous. But let me back up. In the late 90s, Marvel was crawling out of the pits of bankruptcy. Things weren't particularly rosy for the comic book giant, and in 1998, they wanted something really badly. Cash. Sony also wanted something equally as bad. The silver screen rights to everyone's favorite web slinger. So, Sony came to Marvel and put together a licensing deal. These deals gave Sony the exclusive rights to make Spider-Man movies while Marvel retains the ownership of the character itself. In response, Marvel offered them nearly everything but Spidey, Iron Man, Thor, all of the names I mentioned for just $25 million in cash. That's it. The price of an expensive New York City apartment. For a point of reference, Black Panther made that much in just a few hours on its opening day. Sony's response? And this is a direct quote. "Nobody gives a shit about any of the other Marvel characters. Go back and get a deal done for Spider-Man." Obviously, we know now how insane that mistake was, but Marvel would sell Spidey on screens to Sony for $7 million. But there was a caveat. Under the terms of this deal, Sony had to get out Spidey films every few years. They would obviously go on to make 3 Spider-Man films of varying quality with Toby Maguire, but this very same provision forced them to immediately reboot the franchise with Andrew Garfield, and this is super important for what's currently going on. They'd make another massive mistake.
Or we could do something else, or we could, if you don't, we could...
In 2011, not knowing what to do with Spider-Man and needing their own influx of cash, Sony sold the merchandising rights to Spider-Man back to Marvel, which means that now, Marvel owns the rights to sell and profit off of Spidey toys, apparel, and merch, and Sony is left with nothing but movie money. And then, this happens.
You ever tried shawarma? There's a shawarma joint about 2 blocks from here. I don't know what it is, but I want to try it.
And now we arrive at why Disney can't and won't just buy Spidey. See, Sony lent, ironically, Spider-Man to the MCU. The way it was to work was simple. Sony would have full creative control of all Spider-Man solo movies, but Kevin Feige and his team would be the creative leads, handling casting and overall direction. But money-wise, Sony kept 95% of the box office take, and Marvel keeps 100% of the merch revenue. Everyone wins, right? The movies do well, Sony gets their money, and the movies push the merch and Marvel gets theirs. Until recently, Marvel decided they wanted a new deal. Under the terms of this new deal, they would split the funding for the films 50-50 with Sony, and the box office take 50-50 with Sony, as opposed to the 95-5. The contract dispute begins, and here we are. Disney can't just buy Spider-Man back, can they? Well, no. See, they could attempt to buy the movie rights back from Sony now, but Sony has no incentive to sell those rights, like, at all. They're making boatloads of cash off the films. They just won an Oscar for Into the Spider-Verse, and they're building a new franchise around Venom. The Spider-World is too lucrative for a company whose film arm has been hemorrhaging cash for years, so they're incredibly unlikely to just sell the rights. So the question becomes, why doesn't Disney just buy Sony or Sony Pictures? Well, there's 2 reasons. The first is all about monopoly. See, there are laws in place to ensure that one company does not control a certain amount of the industries within which they operate. Essentially, the law doesn't want a company monopolizing all business and privatizing individually too much of one industry because, well, that much control can be dangerous for not just the consumer, but the business itself and the government. So it's unlikely that Disney would even risk pursuing a purchase of Sony Pictures given the recent acquisitions of, well, Pixar, Marvel, Star Wars, The Simpsons, all of Fox, and you get the idea. So then you widen the question. Well, can't they just buy all of Sony? They could, But that would be another legal risk, as well as a potentially pricey and unnecessary purchase. Sony does a lot. They make TVs, media players, game consoles, they're a publisher. They aren't Fox. They're very much so a producer of goods, not just media. Buying a giant international company to put Peter Parker next to Thor would be, let's just say, a little bit of overkill. Not to mention next to impossible. But here's the kicker. Disney doesn't really need to do any of these things, nor do they seem like they want to. Yes, I'm sure they'd love to have Spider-Man all to themselves, but they don't need that. Spider-Man's global retail sales, as of 2014, when it comes to the things they own the exclusive rights to, was $1.3 billion annually. That number predates Avengers Endgame, one of the most successful and profitable films of all time. That $1.3 billion in retail sales is more than double any other superhero, Marvel or DC. That number dwarfs Batman, Superman, Iron Man, you name it. The reality is that Marvel is making far more money off of merchandising rights than they ever could the film rights. So the deal with Sony, the one where they borrow Spidey for the MCU, is much more about boosting merchandising sales for Disney than it is ticket sales. There's absolutely no escaping the reality that the MCU was doing fine before Spider-Man, and it will do fine after. But it's also in Sony's best interest to keep Spidey in the MCU. Let's face it, Spider-Man 3, Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2 not only were flawed, but they showed a clear decline in the studio's continued ability to sell tickets. The whole reboot, refresh idea isn't exactly a seller. And this isn't a surprise. Sony's entire film arm has been struggling so much so that there's been talk for over 2 years of them literally selling off their investment in film entirely, potentially to Apple. The cash injection of Spidey without having to do half of the work is a pretty good deal for Sony. But the reason I'm talking about this, and the reason I think it's important, is something I don't see enough people addressing. There's a problem with all of this. When companies like Sony hold huge IPs hostage, like they are here, it's the fans who are ultimately going to suffer. Spider-Man is a Marvel property. Purchasing a license does not make you the creator or even the owner of an intellectual property. Spider-Man knows where its home is, and so does its fans. Imagine a world where a reasonable offer from Marvel could give them back one of their most important heroes, full stop. Sony has been more than irresponsible with Spidey. Yes, they did create 2 tremendous films, but from there it was a mess of delusion and confusion. And their deal requires the company to push out sequel after sequel, reboot after reboot, just to keep the rights to the character, which in turn, as we've seen, slowly erodes the substance of Spider-Man's presence in film, which fans don't want and aren't necessarily looking forward to. Creating an unfortunate situation where removing Spider-Man from the MCU would force even more urgency onto Sony Pictures, and put a franchise whose heels would already be dug back into the ground even further on the ropes, with a studio who's already on its last legs. Sony Pictures is constantly in a state of trying to survive, their wins being followed by losses. Marvel doesn't want to or need to buy Spider-Man from Sony because Disney knows what everyone else in finance knows. If they wait long enough, they just might receive the spandex-covered gift they've been waiting for on their terms. Unfortunately, we the fans may just have to suffer until they do.
Director Sam Raimi's 2007 would-be epic Spider-Man 3 is something of a cultural punching bag. People love to hate it, and there's a definitive reason for this scorn. The villains. Not characters themselves, but the fact there's just too many of them. Spider-Man 3 isn't alone in this though. This is a common problem for superhero films. X-Men 3 has Magneto, Juggernaut, and the US military, Angel's dad, and an army of no-name mutants. Batman and Robin have Mr. Freeze, Poison Ivy, and Bane. And even The Dark Knight Rises features Bane, Deputy Commissioner Foley, and Talia al Ghul. There's a virtual sea of films that spawn franchises, and one of the major issues with the later installments is the fact that the casts just balloon in order to include way too many characters. But why is the film so derided? Why did Spider-Man 3 fail so spectacularly when its predecessors, made by the exact same people, were so successful they basically kicked off the superhero film craze that we're still living in? Think about it. Spider-Man 3 and X-Men are the launching pads that produced the MCU. But that success was cut short after only a few short years. The dizzying heights of Spider-Man and its sequel Spider-Man 2, commonly thought as one of the best superhero films ever produced, were tragically cut short when Sony Pictures interfered with the creative process and strong-armed the director of the multi-billion-dollar franchise into using not just one, not two, but 3 villains. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Villains, and how too much of a good thing is almost mathematically provable as a bad thing. Most films, and definitely superhero films, follow a very rigid structure, directly descended from Joseph Campbell's ideals of the hero with 1,000 faces. This famous book that Campbell compiles is a deep analysis of myths, legends, and stories that every culture across the globe has told themselves. It's an analysis that breaks down these tales into their individual components and attempts to learn why people from as early as the Stone Age liked their stories structured the same way we like them now, thousands of years later. There's always some sort of inciting incident that acts as a call to adventure. The main character must travel outside their comfort zone, fight for a higher ideal or calling, and learn some profound lesson. Then, at the end of the story, they will return back to their place of origin as a changed and evolved person. Every story from Star Wars to Jason and the Argonauts shares these common elements. They are the formulating building blocks of civilization practically. They're the parcels of information that allows us to understand the world around us. Because this structure is so hardwired into narratives, and the fact that superhero films are almost more commodities than escapist fantasies now, they have a series of boxes that need to be checked. Much like stories from Campbell's The Hero's Journey, you have to have your origin sequence, you have to have your alpha costume and your beta costume, you have to have fight scenes that showcase the character's newfound otherworldly abilities, and most important of all, you need a good villain. Any villain worth their salt is a reflection of the hero. They expose the audience to a deeper truth about the protagonist, push them in new ways, or expose the side of them they're desperately attempting to hide. If you're looking at superheroes and their paired villains, Red Skull showcases what could happen if Captain America became too authoritarian and too committed to country over his ideals. Loki is an exploration of the duplicitousness of man's basic instincts, contracted against Thor's inherent heroism. And Mandarin's magic serves as a metaphor for a return to the old ways, and how Iron Man's constant striving for progress and the new is always met with people yearning for the status quo of yore. In terms of the first Spider-Man, Norman Osborn is a rich tycoon businessman who has everything that Peter Parker lacks. Power, wealth, societal influence, they all come naturally to him. He's also filled with guile and is constantly attempting to play the angles, while Peter Parker is pure of heart. When he eventually falters, which causes the death of Uncle Ben, it compels him to swear he'll never embrace that side of him ever again. He's a good person through and through. And this sets the character up for a lifetime of attempting to help people, to atone for this mistake. Norman Osborn, as a villain, constantly pushes and tempts Peter Parker. They are polar opposites, reflections of each other. And you understand this dichotomy and relationship because of the time and energy Raimi and company put into the construction of the first Spider-Man film, which then leads us to Spider-Man 3. Why do people hate it so much? Why is it such a laughing stock? I'm sure you can guess, but the simple answer is that Raimi didn't want Venom in the movie. Sony was convinced that the character of Eddie Brock, aka Venom, had a huge commercial and merchandise potential for them. They knew that the character, who originated in the 80s, co-created by Todd McFarlane and David Michelinie, had a massive following among hardcore Spider-Man fans. Raimi, on the other hand, found the character to be blunt, one note, and not thematically in the line of the Spidey villains he loved. Raimi was a 60s and 70s Spider-Man fan, not much for the bombastic 80s and 90s work. But the real answer is that there are just too many villains in the film. In this film, you have Harry Osborn, Venom, and the Sandman. To make things even more confusing, there's no hierarchy in this roguish gallery. It's not as though there's a master criminal employing these other two characters as foot soldiers. Each one of them ostensibly has an arc that is equivalent to a main arc of a villain in a film, with only a third of real estate in runtime. Harry Osborn is supposed to be a dark reflection of what Peter Parker could become. He is a boy the same age as Peter, however, he was raised in a decidedly different socioeconomic bracket, which has warped him and caused him to be jealous, filled with anger, and covetous. It also doesn't help that most of the film they gave Harry amnesia and a horrible sky snowboarding costume, it's pretty bad, no matter how you spin it. The film also gives Sandman a healthy retroactive continuity-based origin. It says that he was a part of the robbery that ultimately caused Uncle Ben's death. Each of the two arcs could be a movie in and of themselves, but then to top it all off, you have the story of Eddie Brock, Peter Parker's competitive co-worker, who is given an alien symbiote costume that grants him powers to rival Spider-Man. To boil it down even more, Harry Osborn is a dark reflection of Peter Parker, Eddie Brock is a dark reflection of Peter Parker, and Sandman is intended to be a character that would showcase Peter Parker's greatest mistake. You can see that structurally, not only are these three characters not working in tandem literally, but their arcs don't complement each other either. They're not exposing new sides of the character that we're following, and they're also not all thin slices of the same thematic idea. It's very apparent why the film has this many villains, but it's still frustrating. Harry is there because after the revelation that he knows Peter Parker is Spider-Man in Spider-Man 2, the creative team couldn't walk that back. So his storyline had to come to the forefront. Sam Raimi is a big fan of Ditko-era Spider-Man comics and obviously wanted to make a Sandman movie. And Venom, well, that's all Sony. As outlined above, when you have these conflicting creative visions, your film just ends up being a garbled mess. The climax of the film, featuring Sandman, Venom, Spider-Man, the Green Goblin, is supposed to feel like an epic showdown, when all the plot threads we've been following come together and crescendo into a grand finale. What we actually got was...
I should never have hurt you. Said those things.
None of that matters, Peter.
just one cringy forced emotional scene after the next. None of the arcs work properly because they don't get developed enough, because there literally isn't enough time. There's way too many characters at the climax of the film. Could this film have worked if Green Goblin was not positioned as a Harry redemption story, and was instead a Harry using Sandman and Venom as proxies, trying to tear down his former friend emotionally and physically? Could the film have worked if we forgot about Venom altogether, saved him for another time? Yes, absolutely. But that's not the direction the film went in, and what we're left with is a prime example of how not to have multiple villains.
You come in here again, and we will find you, and we'll eat your face right off your head. Do you understand?
There's a saying in storytelling that reads something to the effect of, "The greatest villains are often the heroes of their own stories." There's a righteousness to villainy that operates in various extremes within a story, and it's often through that righteousness that audiences are enabled to follow these villains' wrongdoings from a place of empathetic understanding. In turn, this creates a bit of a tumultuous relationship between the audience and the villain. We understand why these villains may be doing what they're doing, however, we don't necessarily agree with the means they take to achieve it. Sometimes these villains' motives stray far away from redemption. A good example of this might be Thanos from Marvel's Avengers. He sees sentient life as the sole force behind the imbalance of the universe, and seeks to eliminate half of all sentient life from existence to correct it. And you can't bring a villain back from something like random intergalactic genocide, but that doesn't mean that all villains are beyond redemption. Today, we're going to be taking a look at how to give a villain a redemption arc, and we're going to use one of Marvel's more iconic villains to do it. Venom is a tricky character to get right. And he's an even trickier character to get right without Spider-Man around to deepen the symbiote story. 2018's Venom, while far from being a perfect film by any definition of the term, was not only able to introduce Venom as an extremely dangerous villain, they were able to present the growth and understanding necessary to completely redeem the character into an anti-hero by the film's completion.
On my planet, I am kind of a loser, like you.
Excuse me?
And I'm getting to like it here.
This film was undoubtedly controversial with fans seeking pure retelling of Venom's origins, and you know what? That controversy is completely warranted. Venom was one of the most popular comic book villains of the 90s, and 2007's Spider-Man 3 really let Spider-Man fans down, as one of Spider-Man's most iconic villains was relegated to little more than a rushed side plot with little to no substance. So the idea of creating an origin story for Venom, this time entirely without Spider-Man, likely left some fans on the fence with their feelings about Venom being a standalone reboot. However, what the film lacks in comic book accuracy, it more than makes up in treating Venom like a living, breathing, complicated organism that is able to empathize and connect with the tragic host of Eddie Brock. When Venom first introduces itself to Eddie Brock, it is completely obsessed with the idea of destroying all of humanity. It's pretty much as purely evil as evil can be. However, the writers here use the concept of symbiosis to their advantage by allowing us to open to a character like Venom being capable of growth and understanding. Symbiosis, after all, is a two-way street, and as much as Eddie Brock is physically empowered by Venom's more destructive capabilities, Venom is equally as empowered by Eddie Brock's unwavering determination to do the right thing and make the world a better place.
What really made you change your mind?
You did, Eddie.
We say it all the time in the real world. It takes a big person to admit when they're wrong. There's an air of admiration and respect to that phrase. As humans, we're hardwired to forgive people who have made mistakes and done people wrong, provided that those people own up to those mistakes and take the initiative to right the things that they have done wrong. Creating a redemption arc for a comic book villain is not so different from real life. The more we see a character making a concerted effort to right their wrongs, the more we want to forgive them. Granted, this effort often ends with the antagonist giving up their lives, like Doc Ock in Spider-Man 2, or, more famously, Darth Vader in Return of the Jedi. However, had these characters not given their lives to make up for their misdeeds, we likely would have forgotten them almost entirely. It's exactly what happened with characters like Loki or the Scarlet Witch, though the latter seems as if she might be swinging back in the opposite direction after WandaVision. As audience members, we are constantly cheering for the humanity in characters. Oddly enough, another thing that makes Venom so impressive is that we are consistently rooting for a character's humanity, despite that character being one of the farthest things away from humanity that you could possibly imagine. Venom is a sentient amalgamation of parasitic alien cells, but by the end of Venom, we are actively rooting for the symbiote to thwart its own plans to save the day. Why? Because Venom appeals to our humanity by demonstrating an ability to understand the difference between right and wrong.
There are good people in this world, a lot of them, and then there are bad people. You have to tell the difference.
There are other layers of giving a villain a proper redemption arc at play here. For starters, Venom seeks to thwart the symbiote's plan before they are executed. This is a big part of what makes Venom redeemable. Had the symbiotes been allowed to invade Earth and begin consuming humanity, a redemption arc might have been a little more difficult to execute. So balance is also something extremely important to consider. This is a concept that has been thought about at length for centuries. The concept of morality and the balance of good and evil is something that has been contemplated since humans learned how to communicate, if not longer. We see evidence of an understanding of morality in greater apes as well. So perhaps it's something that is just completely ingrained in all of us. Yin and yang, balanced duality, opposing forces. However you choose to describe it, to truly achieve retributive justice for an evil character, the good they do needs to, at the very least, be on par with the evil that they do, which is probably why so many writers end up killing off their antagonists. After all, there's no greater sacrifice than one's own life. While killing off your antagonist in an act of martyrdom isn't necessarily a new concept, it has literally been done for centuries, it can almost feel a little like taking the easy route to addressing morality in a work of fiction. It's much more difficult to write a redemption arc for a villain in which he not only survives at the end, but effectively becomes the hero of the story. It's so difficult that it almost never happens. The Terminator? Self-sacrifice. Severus Snape? Self-sacrifice. Darth Vader? Self-sacrifice. Kylo Ren? Self-sacrifice. Even Loki ends up self-sacrificing. It's very seldom that a villain survives their redemption arc. In fact, it happens so rarely that one of the only other villains we can think of that ends up surviving their redemption arc is the Grinch.
The Grinch found the strength of 10 Grinches, plus 2.
The same mechanics in redeeming that character are at play with Venom. The Grinch's heart grows. The character becomes more than just a sociopathic monster hell-bent on depriving people of their joy and ruining lives. Through his experiences of profound kindness from the people of Whoville, he becomes an emotionally considerate being who develops a profound understanding of right and wrong and makes an indelible effort to correct his mistakes. Are we saying that Venom is the Grinch of the MCU? No, there's nothing Christmassy about this guy at all. However, the ability to play off the audience's capacity for forgiveness and understanding is definitely at play in both of these films, and it works wonders for giving a character a redemption arc without forcing them to end their lives in the process. Venom delivers a redemption arc that is seemingly impossible to pull off. They take a disgusting, ugly, sentient pile of parasitic black ooze with designs of consuming every living being on the planet and send it through a deep and emotional journey through the eyes of an incredibly sympathetic human host. And by the end of it, that pile of ooze ends up feeling more human than a majority of the other characters in the film. Whether you loved Venom or hated it, it's hard to argue that this film was able to pull off a redemption arc that on paper seems almost impossible.
Great honor to meet you, sir.
Harry tells me you're quite the science whiz. You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
The difference between a good movie and a great movie sometimes is just casting. The right actor paired with the right role can generate lightning in a bottle for a film production. It can reframe the entire context of a script. In the terms of most superhero movies, the whole film relies on the casting of the hero. However, sometimes, well, rarely, it might prove to be the opposite.
40,000 years of evolution and we barely even tapped the vastness of human potential.
In 2002 Spider-Man, Willem Dafoe delivers one of the most important performances of any superhero film in the last 20 years. But it's in the how that things get more interesting. Green Goblin first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man 14. Stan Lee originally intended the character to be a literal goblin unleashed by an archaeological dig in Egypt. However, Steve Ditko, not liking that idea, made him simply a man with gadgets and a flying glider who used the persona of a goblin to strike fear into people. As his appearances went on, it was revealed that he was actually Norman Osborn, the father of Peter's best friend Harry, and that he had taken a goblin formula in order to give himself super strength. Ultimately, Norman Osborn would prove to be a perennially popular character that would be almost as iconic as Spidey himself in some ways. When it came time for Sam Raimi and Sony to produce a Spider-Man feature film, it wasn't difficult for them to find their antagonist and their actor, Willem Dafoe.
I'm here.
If you can mentally travel back to the days of yesteryear when the superhero was right down there with the video game movie or the film adapted from a toy line. You had Dolph Lundgren as the Punisher, that Captain America movie with the son of the guy who wrote Catcher in the Rye, and Lou Ferrigno's Hulk. It was pretty slim pickings. What Raimi and company would create would not only launch the superhero boom that we still are in the midst of today, but create one of the most enduringly impressive adaptations of a comic book ever. Raimi's Spider-Man film is a near-perfect distillation of what works about the character and why he's so important. It's about choosing your destiny, about how the content of your character is the most important attribute anyone can have, about the weight of responsibility and the burden of power. It's the character piece created by someone who's obviously a die-hard fan, and that somehow made its way through the studio system. But a lot of it ticks to the variables that aren't red and in spandex. Raimi's Spider-Man brilliantly executed the themes of what makes Spider-Man an ongoing title-level character. The struggle to balance personal life and a heroic one, the tensions of his role. While the film balanced these overlapping ideas beautifully, it really lives or dies on the shoulders of that antagonist. The phrase, "they always say a hero is only as good as his villain," comes into play here. When they first started discussing the role, Raimi gave Dafoe a copy of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He wanted to emphasize the duality of Norman Osborn, to really lean into the fact that while Spider-Man was attempting to make the right decisions, Norman had made one mistake, and it would define the rest of his life. After taking the experimental compound, Norman's goblin persona would forever be the one in charge of the show, and it would be up to Dafoe to make this tightrope act work. Like here, with Dafoe elegantly convincing the audience that there are two distinct personalities warring for control within his body.
You killed them.
We killed them.
We?
Remember your little accident in the laboratory?
The technical dance of camera angles and mirror tricks could prove frustrating to another actor, but for Dafoe, it's obvious that he's in his element. He makes such minor decisions as an actor that when you call them out, they seem a little campy. He arches his eyebrows and lowers his voice whenever the Goblin is in control.
Godspeed, Spider-Man.
If you pay attention, whenever he's being possessed by the Goblin, Dafoe extends his neck just slightly and tilts his head down, almost talking through his arched eyebrows. It sounds like something that you'd instantly notice, but it comes off as relatively subtle. His Norman voice is also spoken a register higher than it normally would. It's all relatively impressive.
Performance enhancers. Bingo. Me. Your greatest creation.
Throughout the movie, he executes these operatic ideas in such a natural and grounded way that you instantly believe it. You never question for a moment that these are choices being made by an actor, they just feel organic. And when asked about why he wanted to take on the challenge of Green Goblin, Dafoe himself said, "I wanted to do it very badly. It was competitive. I remember I was making a movie in Spain and they flew a casting director out to do a screen test in my hotel room. That's how I got the role. I had to fight for the role. My friends were like, 'Really, you're going to do a cartoon movie?' Some of them snobbed it, but I thought, no, it'll be cool. This is interesting. Movies from comics were not a normal thing. It felt like something new, and when you had Sam Raimi, he knew this material and loved this material, it was a double role. He understood what he was getting himself into, better than most actors at that time, and it comes across in his performance. You can feel his enthusiasm in every second of this film. Similar to how Toby Maguire put on muscle for his role, Willem's wiry physique is as iconic today as it was in the 2000s. In many ways, the role is a dark reflection of Spider-Man's truth in the film. They both express themselves through their masks. Peter, who is a nerdy, sheltered kid, gets to be who he wishes he was when he dons the Spider-Man mask. He makes jokes, he's charming, and knows exactly what to say in every moment, in every conversation. Goblin, on the other hand, uses his mask to shield himself from admonishment for his psychotic desires. He embraces the worst parts of himself because he's now free from judgment. And both Maguire and Dafoe play these roles excellently, which is no easy task considering Dafoe is acting through 4 inches of plastic for the majority of the time he's in the Goblin suit. And all of these things kind of dovetail into a moment like this. Climactic third act battle between Goblin and Spider-Man sees Norman completely overpower Peter until in a last push, Peter gains the upper hand. But just as he's about to deliver the final blow, the Goblin leaves Norman's mind, causing him to plead with Spider-Man for his life, which works on Peter. And then there's this.
The Goblin killed. I had nothing to do with it. Don't let him take me again. I beg you.
Don't let him take me again. This might be the best acting in any superhero movie due to its nuances. It's so apparent that for a split second, it is Norman Osborn pleading for his life, and then mid-sentence, the Goblin takes him. Dafoe's voice shifts, but then the Goblin tries to pretend to be Norman, and that's where the Goblin attempts to offer Peter what he's always wanted, a father.
I've been like a father to you. Be a son to me now.
Which leads to the perfect ending for a Spider-Man movie, better than really any other Spider-Man movie has even come close to accomplishing.
I have a father. His name was Ben Parker.
Perfect character work. And none of this would land half as well without Dafoe acting as the backbone for it all. Spider-Man functions much like the ancient myths of Greece and Rome. He acts as a way for contemporary audiences to grapple with ideas of self-determination and moral quagmires. Every ancient hero is judged against their foes. Where would Beowulf be without Grendel, Thor without Loki, Perseus without Medusa? The villains act as the impediment for our character's growth. By overcoming them, our protagonist shows his strength and cunning. In Spider-Man's case, in some ways that becomes less important, because it's Dafoe's menacing multi-tier performance that takes Sam Raimi's initial Spider-Man outing and transforms it into something much more interesting. And the point here is pretty black and white. It's not just casting is important, but every single bit of casting is important. Not just your hero, and not even just your villain. Everyone that opens their mouth, everyone that moves on your screen matters. And it's worth remembering that. A superhero movie in the early 2000s, late 90s could have lived and died by its hero, but Raimi and Sony understood something a little bit different, that it lives and dies by everyone. And in turn, it's not just Spider-Man that becomes so special.
It's Spider-Man!
What? Spider-Man? Where? Oh, I just get so flustered when I meet a celebrity. I just don't know what to say.
Spider-Man, one of the most enduringly popular comic book characters ever created. His timeless struggle between heroic ideals and the necessities of daily life have proven him to be highly relatable to generations of fans. And then there's this version of Spider-Man.
Surrender by order of Lord Tiger and the High Evolutionary.
And everything was going so well till now.
The Spider-Man series, time forgot. It's hard to remember a time before Spider-Man was a box office juggernaut. However, despite his current cultural ubiquity, he wasn't always considered the most commercially viable superhero on the planet. In fact, it arguably wasn't even the iconic Raimi interpretation of Spider-Man that put him on Hollywood's and a generation of fans' radar. It was this version.
Wait here! What? But, I just have to toss out the garbage!
The Fox Kids animated series titled Spider-Man ran from November 19, 1994 to January 31, 1998. A total of 5 seasons encompassing 65 episodes were produced. It received rave reviews and high ratings for the duration of its run. However, the John Semper-helmed version of Our Friendly Neighborhood Wall Crawler was thought to have aged out of its key demographics, and so it was not renewed for the 6th season, despite ending on one of the most dramatic cliffhangers in kids' animated programming.
Well, Madam Webb, where to now?
Face front, true believer.
we are going to find the real Mary Jane Watson.
Ostensibly, as soon as the show went off the air, Marvel, Fox, and Saban, the production company behind X-Men the Animated Series and Power Rangers, started having conversations about reviving the show or creating a new incarnation of Spider-Man to feed the hungry audience pool. Only there was one catch. Marvel Comics had just declared bankruptcy and had sold off all the film rights to their most popular characters in order to stay solvent, which meant this new version of Spidey, it couldn't include anything from the source material. So what did Marvel, Fox, and Saban do? Well, at first they discussed making a motion comic adaptation of the initial 26 Steve Ditko and Stan Lee issues of Amazing Spider-Man. But these plans were abandoned quickly, thankfully, because of all the previously mentioned rights issues. They next discussed adapting Spider-Man 2099, a futuristic Spider-Man story about billionaire geneticist Miguel O'Hara 100 years in the future. However, this also didn't land on receptive ears because WB had just launched Batman Beyond. Avi Arad, the individual behind many of Marvel's initial forays onto the stage and screen, contacted Will Meugniot, animation producer, writer, and illustrator, to create something wholly new for Spidey's next animated cinematic outing. And what we got was ostensibly Blade Runner meets Planet of the Apes, starring Spider-Man. The central plot of Spider-Man Unlimited is that J. Jonah Jameson's son, John, is an astronaut who's piloting a rocket to the newly discovered Counter-Earth. At the rocket launch, Spider-Man witnesses Venom and Carnage sneak onto the rocket ship and hitch a ride, eventually causing the rocket to appear to crash on the alternate planet. Presuming his son dead, Jameson places a bounty on Spider-Man's head, who he blames for the accident, forcing the web-slinger to steal a rocket of his own, upgrade his suit, and make a beeline for alternate Earth in an attempt to save John Jameson. However, what Spidey isn't prepared for is the fact that the entire planet is run by animal-human hybrids with a dystopian overlord named the High Evolutionary. Spider-Man quickly falls in with a ragtag group of human rebels, led by John Jameson, and helps them lead a resistance against a totalitarian and anti-human governmental regime. Over the course of the show, Spider-Man gets a job taking photos at the Daily Bite, Counter-Earth's Daily Bugle, rents a room from a kindly doctor named Naoko Yamada-Jones, and consistently has to balance attempting to help lead the human resistance and paying rent, just like any good Spider-Man story should function. The primary antagonists of this show are the High Evolutionary's enforcers, the Knights of Wundagore. 4 flying robot horse-riding anthropomorphized heavies. Are they as cool as the Sinister Six? No, not really. They kind of suffer from the same fate everything in this show does. Just not enough development. Despite being a show without any source material, you can feel that Will Meugniot and writers Michael Reeves, Larry Bordy, and Robert Gregory Brown all have lots of ideas for where to take this story. You know, the strangest part of the show, though, is the fact that it's lightly in continuity with the original 1994 version. Sometimes. The way the universe of Spider-Man Unlimited works is that everything about Earth also exists on Counter-Earth, but just a bit different. Which doesn't really make sense because it's not an alternate universe's Earth that has appeared in our solar system. It's a planet that has always existed exactly parallel to Earth, so we've never been able to see it because of the sun. The execution of that concept probably wouldn't even draw attention to that fact if it wasn't for the fact that quite a few of Spidey's traditional villains show up on Counter-Earth in alternate form. The only established Marvel character that appears in Unlimited that doesn't appear in the 94 show is Jack Kirby's Machine Man. And ironically, this version of Machine Man isn't that far off from the original in terms of execution. You know, aside from the fact that Machine Man, canonically, within Marvel Comics, is literally the baby from the end of 2001, A Space Odyssey. Yeah, wild story, look it up. The key distinction between the original show and Unlimited, animal people aside, is the art style. The style of the show, established by Meugniot and refined by character designers Shannon Eric Denton and Roy Burdine, has a more angular comic book-inspired aesthetic. They had large black spots, chunky holding lines, sharp angular features, and an attempt at filtering in cyberpunk aesthetics. The show also used color in an unconventional way for 1999. All the backgrounds were painted by Kelly Atkins and Philip Kim, and color-styled by Joe Meugniot. Again, opting for large black areas and also day glow, almost watercolor warmth to the cityscapes. Side note, it also features one of the best intro credits in any superhero show ever, with a near panel-for-panel recreation of Ditko's artwork. It's fantastic. which brings us to the suit. Today, a world populated by a young version of Spider-Man who's consistently appearing in $200 million blockbusters while wearing a robotic Spider-Man suit designed for him by Tony Stark. The fact that Spider-Man Unlimited was wearing a robotic suit powered by nanobots designed for him by Reed Richards doesn't seem that crazy, but it was. This suit had extra abilities, a sleek new aesthetic that was definitely not ripped off from Spidey 2099, and a cape made of webs. And as if all this crazy stuff wasn't enough to get you to go watch it, the show lasted 13 episodes and, wait for it, ends on a cliffhanger. Yep, it only had a few brief moments in the sun before it was apparently flushed from everyone's memories. This show is so rarely talked about in fan circles, they've never even brought the suit back as a nostalgia play in the comics. So why did Spidey Unlimited get the axe? You see, it wasn't actually the ratings that killed Spider-Man Unlimited, it was Pokemon. The pocket monsters we all know and love were such a sales bonanza that it caused most of the networks to reevaluate their slates of shows and refocus their development dollars on new shows aimed at copying or interpreting Pokemon's formula. Plans for a second season were actually underway prior to the official cancellation. Larry Brody, the previously mentioned Spider-Man Unlimited staff writer, actually created outlines and scripts for numerous episodes and an overall plan to create 11 new episodes that would bring the show to a close. The lasting impact of Spider-Man Unlimited is hard to pin down. It feels like hardcore Spidey heads really love the show, but in terms of the wider audience, it's completely forgotten. I think part of the reason it's not well remembered is because the basic setup, while really interesting at first glance, is shaky. Is it an alternate universe or just another planet? Why are there parallel versions of characters we know? And why doesn't Spider-Man react to them? The other aspect of the show that hurts its rewatchability is that Spider-Man isn't particularly heroic in it. He's always reacting to what everyone else is doing. He's constantly telling John Jameson, "This isn't our fight. People are being oppressed, Spider-Man. Whatever happened to with great power comes great responsibility." I know when I first watched it as it was airing, I was irate that the show was not going to acknowledge anything about Spider-Man the Animated Series cliffhanger with Madame Web and Spidey going out into the multiverse to find his version of Mary Jane. But after the initial ire wore off, I really enjoyed the show as it was airing. And in rewatching it for this video, I got to say it's a bit clumsy and doesn't exactly know what it's doing sometimes, but the general thrust of it rules. If nothing else, come on, the suit is fantastic. People love to talk about Spider-Man 3 and the Toby Maguire dance number as being the lowest point in Spider-Man's cinematic journey. But honestly, Peter Parker controlling an army of drones might be the worst thing that happened to Spider-Man, well, ever. And I've read Identity Crisis.
Peter, do you want me to cancel the drone strike on Brad Davis?
Did you just punch Flash?
No. Firing.
And yet somehow the key creatives behind this blunder gave us No Way Home, quite possibly the best Spider-Man film of all time. And most importantly, the film that saved the MCU's Spider-Man. First created in the pages of Amazing Fantasy number 15 by Steve Ditko and Stan Lee, Peter Parker's eternal struggle between the weight of heroic responsibilities and the trials and tribulations of real life is a timeless tale that we've basically been consuming nonstop for close to 80 years straight. Spidey first appeared on the small screen in 1967 and has been a semi-constant in TV shows, video games, and movies ever since. This obviously climaxed in the early 2000s with the Sam Raimi-fronted Spider-Man trilogy, which led into Mark Webb's two Amazing Spider films, the second of which underperformed and led everyone's favorite wall crawler back into the loving arms of Marvel.
You're the Spiderling, crime-fighting spider.
Spider-Man.
However, there's one problem with the Marvel Cinematic Universe's version of Spider-Man. He's not really Spider-Man. He looks like Spider-Man and he talks like Spider-Man.
You ever seen that really old movie? Empire Strikes Back?
But the stories he's in aren't really Spider-Man stories. People who don't understand the structure of a Spidey story always seem to think Spider-Man's origin is that he gets bit by a spider and gains the powers of a spider. That's a piece of it, but not actually the whole story. The structural elements of what makes Spider-Man Spider-Man are the eternal themes of service, dedication, and responsibility in the face of uncompromising personal loss. It's crucial that the character needs to misuse that power, and then learn from that mistake and choose to dedicate himself to acting selflessly. In the original comics, it was using his powers to make money and gain fame and attention. and then not stopping a thief from robbing a wrestling promotion that he had taken part in.
You could have taken that guy apart. Now he's gonna get away with my money.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
This criminal later is the man who's responsible for killing Peter's Uncle Ben. That's the origin of Spider-Man. It's Peter being so consumed with guilt that he monastically dedicates himself attempting to make up for that one moment of selfishness that he wishes he could take back. And the MCU Spider-Man went 6 appearances without having an Uncle Ben moment. Yes, we've seen the origins twice, we didn't need to see it again, but what we did need was a Spider-Man who understood the cost of being Spider-Man. And to make it even worse, the MCU ostensibly just neutered the character. He didn't make his own costume. He didn't learn how to be a hero by himself. He's not a socially awkward teenager by day and a wisecracking masked vigilante by night. He's not a super scientist other than outlined by lip service.
Who manufactured that?
I did.
He's not poor. He's not a photographer for the Daily Bugle or any sort of media outlet. Basically, everything that makes Peter Parker is gone in the MCU, other than jokes, web-slinging, and a costume that's sometimes red and blue. His adventures really do mimic the Jimmy Olsen Superman's PAL comics from the 1960s. These comics are always the same. Jimmy gets into a scrape or some weird adventure, his inquisitive nature or bumbling acts complicate matters, and then Superman comes and saves him, which is exactly what happens in Homecoming. But instead of Superman, it's Iron Man.
Previously on Peter Screws the Pooch, you sneak around behind my back doing the one thing I told you not to do.
Spidey on the Avengers was never the main attraction on the comics, but he was his own distinct person, as opposed to in the MCU, where he's basically Iron Man's ward. But the weird thing about how they build out his placement is that Iron Man is his father figure, without ever really exploring the fact that they've both lost their dads. It's less that Peter is lost and needs a father figure, and more that Iron Man and Peter are put together as a surrogate father and son because they're Marvel's 2 most popular characters. Far From Home, as referenced before, makes the increasingly bizarre plot decision to give teenage Peter Parker an unstoppable drone army. Isn't this the whole plot of Avengers Age of Ultron? Literally, the moral of the movie is that he's learned he was wrong and he's not going to do that anymore. They decided to give Spidey the exact same story, but play it for laughs?
Target is Brad Davis. Initiating strike.
Initiating what now?
This is not a Spider-Man story at all. Who had this idea? Chris McKenna and Eric Summers. They were 2 of the many writers credited on Homecoming, and they received solo credit on Far From Home. And yet, with great mischaracterization comes great opportunities for change. Spider-Man: No Way Home is the best live-action Spider-Man film since Spider-Man 2. The film really celebrates the legacy and the history of the live-action Spider-Man franchises. That's what everyone wants to talk about with No Way Home. It's all the cameos and interconnectedness and continuity. But really, the biggest strength of No Way Home is how writers Chris McKenna and Eric Summers took the teenage misfit, non-Spider-Man, and evolved him into an actual living, breathing Spider-Man. You know it's a brilliant piece of writing when it can juggle the needs of an event picture like Spider-Man: No Way Home, the continuity needs of setting up a multiverse, and the actual arcs of the cast. And on top of all of that, giving the MCU Spider-Man an actual freaking Spider-Man movie to star in. At its core, No Way Home is a coming-of-age tale. It's about the youthful naivety associated with the I can save everyone viewpoint. It's about Peter Parker embracing the idea of self-sacrifice for those people he loves. Most importantly though, the film gives MCU Peter his Uncle Ben moment. During the initial brutal confrontation with the Green Goblin, Aunt May is badly injured and delivers the quintessential,
"With great power, there must also come great responsibility,"
just prior to dying in Peter's arms. This is the moment where Peter's character is actually pushed into realizing that Spider-Man truly is a heavyweight. This is what the other MCU Spider-Man films are so crucially missing. This crescendos throughout the film to Peter actually having to make a crushing choice. He has to choose to sacrifice his relationships with Ned and MJ in order to keep them safe and out of harm's way. He chooses to allow them to move on with their lives, free of his presence, and it's not a one-time choice. He has to continue making that sacrifice every day, just like he has to continue to be Spider-Man every day. It's a soul-crushingly sad idea, a perfect Spider-Man status quo. And then of course you have the last beat of the movie, where we see Peter Parker making his own Spider-Man costume, which looks like the classic John Romita Sr. suit, utter perfection. Spider-Man is an enduring icon for a reason. His timeless struggle between selflessness and the realities of existence are universal in their emotional connectivity. They span generations, walks of life, and cultural backgrounds. It's this struggle between trying to do the right thing and the world working against you that provides the foundational conflict that these stories exist on. And very few examples of that have been seen in the MCU's version of the character. It's been purely coasting off the interconnected universe's brand loyalty and Tom Holland's immense charisma. But Chris McKenna and Eric Summers finally got it right. They understood the character and that Spider-Man movies should be fun, while Spider-Man stories should be about sacrifice.
She told me that with great power comes great responsibility.
Wait, what? How do you know that?
Uncle Ben said it. The day he died. Maybe she didn't die for nothing, Peter.
The idea was to bring together a group of remarkable people, see if they could become something more.
The MCU has taken superheroes from being the laughingstock of Hollywood to the most financially successful genre in global media. And yet, now, with super producer Kevin Feige at full command of everything Marvel, you'd expect things to be chugging along swimmingly. And they are, on one level. However, a closer look reveals a significant problem with Marvel's Phase 4. The MCU started in 2008 with the release of the Robert Downey Jr. vehicle, Iron Man.
I am Iron Man.
The first film in an interconnected web of feature films spanning multiple studios, characters, and franchises. In case you're unfamiliar, the eras of the Marvel Cinematic Universe are divided up into what mega producer Feige and company have termed phases. Phase 1 is 6 films, Iron Man to Avengers. Phase 2 is 6 films, Iron Man 3 to Ant-Man. And Phase 3, acting as the climactic third act of the initial movement of the universe, is 11 films, Captain America Civil War to Spider-Man Far From Home. These 23 films act as a complete story, more or less. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Millions of people from across the globe have thrilled to the exploits and triumphs and failures of the iconic Marvel superheroes. All of these films lead up to the crescendo of the twin capstones to the story, Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. These two films, directed by the Russo brothers, pulled in close to $5.5 billion.
Wait. I think I have $200. Rupees. Which is? $1.50.
They are an achievement in the craft and business of filmmaking that has never been paralleled. They were a definitive end to the story that was jump-started all those years ago in 2008, and then
You gotta move on.
Marvel and the rest of the world had to move on.
No, I don't think I will.
Marvel's hotly anticipated Phase 4 promised new characters, new twists and turns in the ongoing plot, and even more excitement. And now with a new element thrown into the mix, Kevin Feige would be overseeing TV projects for Phase 4, meaning not only would Phase 4 include numerous films, but it would also include 8 TV show projects, each roughly 10 episodes in length. And here's where we get to the problem with Phase 4. Simply put, it's not learning the lessons it needs from the comics. It's overly convoluted, requires literal homework from the audience, and has major structural issues on a storytelling level.
She recast Pietro?
There's been a lot of chatter online about how certain people in the Marvel fandom are frustrated by the fact that there isn't enough forward movement happening on the core story of the MCU. They feel that the MCU is just treading water and has a pacing problem, compared to the breakneck speed that Phases 1 and 2 had. On the overly convoluted front, the film side of things has become so linked to the TV side that there are massive story beats happening behind a paywall on an app that the general public may or may not have access to.
I like your plan, except it sucks, so let me do the plan, and that way it might be really good.
Sure, the first 3 phases of the MCU were a lot to keep straight, but it was 23 movies. It was a linear story. If you showed up to the theater, you got the narrative. Now, you have to juggle the feature films and the vital continuity in the TV shows. Does Doctor Strange 2 make any sense if you haven't seen WandaVision? Not really. Last time we saw Wanda on the big screen, she was reeling from the death of Vision, and now she's a villain talking about children? If you haven't seen the Disney Plus show, you're out of luck.
This doesn't make any sense.
Nah, nothing makes sense here, man. The only thing that does make sense is that nothing makes sense.
Structural issues have always plagued the MCU. Whether their offerings are deemed as too formulaic or struggling with pacing, there always seems to be some common flaws with the different phases of the MCU. For Phase 4, one of the common complaints is that the shows bottom out during the middle of the series. Everything tends to grind to a halt on a plot level. Look at Moon Knight. Yes, the best episode of the series takes place in the middle with Mark running around an Egyptian temple, but then the ensuing 3 episodes are just extended scenes of Oscar Isaac talking to himself.
How is this possible?
I don't know.
Loki and Falcon and the Winter Soldier suffered from similar issues as well. It's a lot to ask of a viewing public to not only sit through all these shows in order to understand a movie, but it's even more to ask when they're not up to the standards the movies have set. Another reason that people are upset at Phase 4 is something comic book fans are very familiar with, but the general public might not be as much. Narrative de-escalation. After a crossover event, big arc, or a significant creative team's run comes to an end, the book typically goes back to basics. It's a way of refreshing the status quo. After Dan Slott's Spidey run ended, you get Nick Spencer taking over Amazing, and the literal title of his first arc being Back to Basics. It's a tried and true tradition in comics. You tell your story, you take the toys out of the play area, and then you reset everything and start building something new. That's what Phase 4 really is. It's a back to basics phase.
Things are about to get weird. Keep your phone on.
Which isn't as fun as the grand scale of the climactic events of Endgame, undoubtedly, but still important. Simply put, they're not going to make an Avengers movie anytime soon. They're focusing on these smaller characters and universe building. These narrative tropes aren't as apparent to filmgoers as comic book readers, so some people have false expectations of what Phase 4 is going to be.
If I tell you what happens, it won't happen.
These back-to-basic storylines are important for the lifeblood of a comic book universe. It's how you establish new characters and new threats. Are the stories being presented in Shang-Chi, Moon Knight, and the other standalone projects the most impactful or mind-blowing? No. But if executed correctly, they have the potential of increasing the texture of the universe and endearing the audience to the characters. Only issue being, it's kind of hit and miss currently. The MCU isn't learning the right lessons from the comics. They're in a back-to-basics era, but they're pitching themselves as still being in full-blown crossover mode, which is leading to audience dissatisfaction and pacing issues. Marvel Comics went through similar issues in the late 1990s. The most infamous example of this is the Clone Saga. This story involved Peter Parker, maybe, or maybe not, being a clone. It ran across all 4 Spidey titles from October 1994 to December of 1996, and was predominantly featured in literally 160 comics. Can you imagine trying to read 160 comic books to try and understand if Peter Parker was a clone? None of these decisions have anything to do with the best way to present a story. They're business choices, and because of that, they make story pacing really hard to make satisfying. Kinda sounds similar to how Disney is shoehorning all the MCU shows onto their new streaming platform and having pacing issues, doesn't it?
We're trying to keep you from tearing the Avengers apart.
And that's how you get some fans saying that Phase 4 feels disjointed and clunky, and that it's not going anywhere, even though it's obviously leading towards Secret Wars. Secret Wars by Jonathan Hickman and Asad Ribic, and loosely based on the original crossover by Jim Shooter and Mike Zeck, features multiversal drama on a Shakespearean scale. In the book, and in Hickman's Avengers run, the Illuminati uncover the fact that the multiverse is collapsing. Dimensions are colliding into each other, killing all of the inhabitants. Our heroes band together in order to stop these tragedies, referred to as incursions, only to fail. The multiverse collapses with only Dr. Doom able to save shards from different realities on a dimensional plane called Battleworld. There, all of our heroes attempt to band together in order to defeat Doom and establish a world that doesn't have zombie Thanos running around. Secret Wars is arguably the best mainstream crossover of the past 30 years. The fact that Marvel is obviously building towards it means their eye is on the prize. All of the clumsiness and strange pacing of Phase 4 will be forgotten once we get to Secret Wars. It's a little bit of a bumpy ride, but we'll get there. Just watch. It'll all be worth it if we get to hear Doom on the big screen say, "That appears untrue."
Okay, that didn't really make sense, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Phase 4 is already the size of Phases 1 and 2 combined in terms of watch hours. There's a sense of urgency with some people where they want the payoffs now. If anything, it's a testament to just how successful Infinity War and Endgame were. The payoffs and conclusions in that film were unlike anything else completed in mainstream cinema before. And because of that, there's a hunger to experience those feelings again. But what so many refuse to acknowledge is that setting up an ending takes time.
Dude, that isn't funny!
It is kind of funny,
man.
Spider-Man is an enduring icon, beloved for close to 70 years. Throughout that time, he's had a wide-reaching cast of supporting characters, villains, and rivals. And yet, none of them have even come close to matching Mary Jane Watson, which makes it all the more surprising when you find out that not only were there plans to include the iconic redheaded bombshell in the Andrew Garfield Amazing Spider-Man films, but they literally wrote scenes for her, cast her, and shot them, only for her to get cut out of the finished film at the last second.
Well, see ya.
After the somewhat bumpy dismount of Spider-Man 3, Sony was looking to continue producing Spider-Man films. Only question was, how? How could they give people more Spider-Man and yet distance themselves from the not well-received most recent version of New York's favorite orphan son? How would they reposition Spidey to make sure he appealed to the younger demographic that was key to the character's success? How would they build a vehicle with enough internal momentum to escape the shadow of one of the most iconic superhero franchises in history? Simple. They just needed something amazing.
I can take it in. No, I can take it in.
You are amazing.
I can take it in.
You are amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Will you say it?
No, I kind of needed to hear that.
They had a release date of November 11th, 2012 before they had a script, so they had to work quickly. The North Star given to the creative team was to make something that felt like Spider-Man, but was tailored to a modern audience. Gone was the science nerd being picked on by Flash Thompson, Peter Parker. Here was a hot topic outsider Peter Parker. The film pulled in close to $757 million, making it a resounding success. Production on a sequel was quickly initiated. Mark Webb and budding movie star Andrew Garfield were brought back, and the script was being tailored to launch a much wider cinematic universe for Spider-Man. A virtual army of writers were involved in the development of Amazing Spider-Man 2, with Alex Kurtzman, Robert Orci, and Jeff Pinkner being some of the key figures. Simultaneously to launching this film, Sony started to unfold a master plan for themselves. Attempting to compete with the rapidly expanding Marvel Cinematic Universe. They wanted to do a Wild Pack movie, a Sinister Six movie, maybe a Venom movie, and potentially even a Black Cat movie. However, Amazing Spider-Man 2 needed to lay the groundwork for all of this. They had tangible proof that people loved this new skateboarding version of Peter Parker, so they wanted to use him as the launching pad for multiple franchises that Sony could make exorbitant amounts of money from. However, there was one key hurdle that needed to be navigated. There had been some creative friction behind the scenes of the first movie. Sony had kept it quiet in the lead up to the film's release, but a large portion of the film was reshot and re-edited in post to minimize a subplot with Peter Parker's parents being spies. While this angle was right out of the comics, Sony execs felt that it was too far a departure from the world established by Sam Raimi and Toby Maguire. Surgeon being multiple times in the film, that was totally believable. But his parents disappearing due to a botched covert secret mission? Yeah, that was a bridge too far. Sony had wanted a Spider-Man movie that felt like what someone would anticipate seeing if they were coming to see a Spider-Man movie. Sony wanted all the standard beloved characters that had appeared in the Raimi movies reintroduced as quickly as possible. Mary Jane, Harry Osborn, and Norman Osborn. This is how you get a new Green Goblin, played by Dane DeHaan, a dying Norman Osborn played by Chris Cooper, and a new, more classically oriented version of Spidey's suit. But Sony didn't want a retread of these characters completely. They also wanted them presented in slightly new ways. They wanted the film to appear like it was offering us new things, most of which we've also seen before. This logic is how you get a post-credit scene that sets up the Sinister Six that never goes anywhere.
Now that Spider-Man's gone, this city will never be the same.
But also, Sony's list of demands couldn't end there. The film needed to build off of the Gwen and Peter romance from the first movie. And it needed its own new villain we hadn't seen before, Electro. Honestly, this film was given such a tall order, it's a miracle it even had a story considering how much pressure Sony was putting on it. This was a lot to squeeze into one 2-hour story, but they went for it. Shailene Woodley, the future star of Divergent and The Fault in Our Stars, was cast as this new version of Mary Jane, a fresh-faced star with a mercurial energy and an emotional resonance that looked to be the big breakout star of the movie. However, with the overstuffed film practically bursting at the seams, there wasn't much room for a significant Mary Jane story within the film. She played a more supporting role, setting MJ up for the next Amazing Spider-Man film. Shailene Woodley only shot for a few days on the film.
Mary Jane was in 4 scenes in the whole film, and it didn't make sense. They're introducing so many new characters, it really didn't make sense to introduce such a vital character to the comic books.
Mary Jane was employed as a coffee shop barista during the film. Ultimately, Mary Jane was not kept in the finished product. Sony and director Mark Webb have said previously that having Mary Jane in the film distracted from the swan song story for Emma Stone's Gwen Stacy. Webb told the LA Times, "Shailene is a brilliant actress and she did a great couple of days' work, but it was very difficult to introduce someone as a competing love interest when so much is on the table with Peter and Gwen. Is this the whole story? Honestly, probably not. The fact that Sony was deeply concerned with setting up the Sinister Six and other rogues gallery for films that would ultimately never materialize was their #1 priority. If Webb and company had wanted to cut something that linked directly to that out of the movie, you bet there would have been a pushback. In this case, Sony was happy to wait for Mary Jane if it meant that they could get their Tarantula and His Amazing Friends theme park ride off the ground. Shailene Woodley is quoted as having said, "Of course I'm bummed, but I am a firm believer in everything happening for a specific reason. Based on the proposed plot, I completely understand the need for holding off on introducing Mary Jane until the next film." Unfortunately, Amazing Spider-Man 2 would be the death knell for Sony's interconnected Amazing Spider universe. Amazing 2 pulled in close to $500 million at the box office off of a budget of $300. It was also critically lambasted, receiving negative feedback about the film's tone, simplicity, and retreads of villains and concepts previously explored in prior Spider-Man films. We all know what happened from here. Kevin Feige came a-knockin', Amy Pascal said, "Okay, let's share Spider-Man," and Tom Holland became a generational definition of the friendly neighborhood wall crawler.
What's up, guys? You forget your PIN number?
When you're trying to build a franchise, it's important to evaluate the topography of your choices appropriately. Sony wanted to run before they learned how to crawl, and an overstuffed, poorly thought-out second installment caused them to have no option but to partner with Marvel. All those spin-off movies they were planning, well, they went nowhere. Until off the back of the MCU Spider-Man, they decided to greenlight Venom, Venom 2, Morbius, and Kraven. And we don't even need to discuss what an ongoing train wreck those films are. As far as Mary Jane goes, was taking her out of Amazing Spider-Man the appropriate move? Yeah, it really seems like it was. The one thing that genuinely works about Amazing Spider-Man 2, aside from the Todd McFarlane-influenced suit, is the chemistry between at the time real-life couple Emma Stone and Andrew Garfield. Their comedic timing is electric.
This is the most cliched hiding place you could have chosen. This is the stupidest hiding place.
Take us to the Bahamas as hiding places.
Their obvious infatuation and attraction for each other lights up on the screen. However, introducing a version of Mary Jane as a competitor to this would be hard to swallow as an audience. Like Webb previously stated, it's hard to really be emotionally invested in Parker's trauma over losing Gwen when he's 1 foot out the door and interested in this new coffee shop employee. If anything, this seems like it ended in a completely amicable way. Shailene Woodley still has quite the impressive career. The movie's failure might have haunted Garfield for a while, but now, thanks to No Way Home, he's gotten his own swan song, so really, all's well that ends well.
What happened to your voice?
What do you mean, what happened to my voice?
I heard you by the bridge. I know what a girl sound like.
We love superheroes. From their meteoric rise to prominence in the 1930s to their cultural ubiquity of today, they've become a symbol for moral fortitude in the eternal quest to defend the downtrodden. And yet, recently there's been a palpable homogeneity specifically in the way they speak. So, why do all superheroes sound the same?
You mocking me? He's trying to copy me.
You're imitating the God-Man.
Superman, Batman, Blade, Spider-Man, and the X-Men. Their film adaptations provided the cultural foundation that the House of Ideas built the MCU on. Despite the wave of successful comic book adaptations that appeared throughout the 2000s, the first film to really give a superhero a quirky, funny, and sardonic personality was 2008's Iron Man. The film's credited screenwriters are Mark Fergus, Hawk Ostby, Art Markham, and Matt Holloway. However, Robert Downey Jr. and Jon Favreau used the script for Iron Man 1 in a highly unconventional manner. They used it as something to play off of, not film. Large chunks of the film were completely improvised on the day by the director and star. Thus, the film has a naturalistic yet hyper-stylized patter to the dialogue. And most importantly, it was funny.
If you douse me again and I'm not on fire, I'm donating you to City College.
This seems like an obvious path to take at this point, considering how it's almost a requirement for the genre, but in 2008, this was a true deviation, and one that would prove wildly successful for everyone involved. Michael Keaton, a literal comedian prior to the role, wasn't funny as Batman. Daredevil, Ghost Rider, Catwoman, none of these films were funny, unless you were laughing at them. Arguably the greatest innovation that Iron Man and the MCU made to the newly blossoming genre was taking a joke-a-minute view on the source material. How do we get people to fall in love with objectively obscure characters like Moon Knight? make them funny and charming.
She said I'll need her to suit.
The ceremonial armor from Concha's temple, not Psycho Colonel Sanders.
The MCU's movies are basically built off having characters banter. But this banter-oriented way of making superheroes speak has its roots all the way back in the comic books. It's hard to overemphasize the effect that Brian Bendis had on the comic book form in the early 2000s. He pioneered the decompressed model of telling stories and brought a real human lens to the characters who had been stagnant for decades. Starting with his Daredevil, Alias, Ultimate Spider-Man work, and running through New Avengers and Secret Invasion work, Bendis took traditional superheroes and made them feel human, primarily due to dialogue. Bendis' chief creative inspiration was David Mamet. The playwright and screenwriter behind Glengarry Glen Ross and Ronin is recognized for his ear for dialogue, extensive monologues, and hyper-specific verbal tics.
A always be B, C closing. Always be closing.
Bendis took these tropes and incorporated them, along with a deep love of crime and genre fiction, into a way of building superhero stories that hasn't been rivaled in the last 30 years. He loves long stretches of dialogue where characters are rapid-fire asking each other questions. He loves quick short bursts back and forth, and specifically, he loves jokes. His DNA is laced all throughout the Marvel films, to say nothing of the fact that he was a founding member of the Marvel Creative Committee, which was a closed-door club of comic book writers that Marvel contracted to consult on all the film projects to try and make them as accurate as possible. As the first phase of the Marvel Universe was gaining momentum, the inevitable question was raised. Who is going to direct the Avengers?
Why the hell should I take orders from you? I need men in those buildings.
They wanted someone who had a keen knack for character, love of Marvel, and an ability to actually adapt a script to the screen. And so, Marvel hired Joss Whedon. Similarly to Bendis, Whedon had made a name for himself through his strong sense of characterization and emphasis on fast-paced, snappy dialogue, which were typically littered with pop culture references. Primarily known as the creator of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Whedon had also worked on the Eisner Award-winning Astonishing X-Men run. A longtime fan of the characters in question, Whedon was responsible for taking what Favreau had established with Downey Jr. and pushing it even further. He really played up the man-out-of-time elements of Cap, the snarkiness of Stark, and the general humor that would be mined out of bouncing the Avengers off of one another. Needless to say, The Avengers was a smash hit, and Marvel signed Whedon to an exclusive contract to write, develop, and consult on all their projects for the next 3 years. This run would eventually come to an end with Age of Ultron not performing quite as well, and Whedon feeling like he was undercut by the studio.
Oh, actually, he's the boss. I just pay for everything and design everything and make everyone look cooler.
Now, by this point, the Marvel machine was a juggernaut, and everyone was trying to get in on the bandwagon, or rebelling against the status quo that Marvel was establishing. The first wave of the DCEU, orchestrated by Zack Snyder, was directly in opposition to the bright and accessible MCU. It was attempting to be a more grounded and adult take on superheroes. It was also trying to embrace gravitas over comedic timing. In theory, that could have worked as an alternative, but in execution, it became something else.
What are your superpowers again?
I'm rich.
Which leads us directly into Justice League. This proved as the trying ground for the does one-size-fit-all approach to dialogue and character execution. Joss Whedon accepted the job of rewriting and refilming large chunks of Justice League after Zack Snyder was forced to step away from the picture. And that's how you get moments like this.
Oh, something is definitely bleeding.
Look, we don't need to rehash it. Justice League was not well received. However, the most important fallout from it was that it made Warner's want to steer away from the dark and gritty stuff they were doing, aside from one-off projects like Joker or The Batman, and have a more bombastic all-ages feel to their mainline cinematic universe. Shazam, Aquaman, and others emphasize a stylistic approach that veers into a more Marvel-adjacent mode of telling stories, namely jokes. Your mileage may vary on if Warner's is fully replicating the Marvel magic, but this issue is something the comics struggle with too, especially when a new writer gets moved up to an A-list level. They could put on a bunch of books and they don't have time to develop unique approaches for their takes. It just becomes the easiest stock solution wins. Every character has the same dialogue style now. In Bendis' critically acclaimed X-Men run and his New Avengers run, multiple characters use Yiddish words or turns of phrases in contexts that aren't exactly true to their character. Fans have pointed out that all of Bendis' characters sound exactly the same. Everyone is quippy and has bouncing dialogue. Everyone. Wolverine doesn't make jokes, unless Bendis is writing him, which is the exact same thing that happened in superhero movies. We used to have the archetype of the stalwart hero and the plucky comic relief, and now we just have the sarcastic hero who cracks jokes at the other character's expense.
I think you're overreacting a little bit.
You must be so embarrassed!
At this point, being a superhero means you have to be funny. Overall, we're reaching such a cultural breaking point with superhero media that there's no way around it. The issue at hand is that there's literally billions of dollars wrapped up in weaponizing these stories to be hyper-commercialized, and the most financially successful versions of the characters have all shared a common voice, a predilection for lifting dialogue and snappy banter. Only problem is, that formula is already old. So what comes next?
Hang loose, Brock. That webbing will melt in a couple of hours.
You can't do this!
I already have.
Spider-Man, the animated series, left an indelible impression on kids throughout the 90s, introducing them to Peter Parker and his varied cast of friends and foes. The show covered just about every aspect of the Wallcrawler's mythos, but when choosing the perfect episode, it's hard to top the series finale, Farewell Spider-Man, an episode that manages to add new elements to the Spider-Man lore and perfectly summarize why he's such a beloved character.
Why did you do that? Let's see. You level Manhattan, destroy Queens. Why would I be mad at you?
2022 marks the 60th anniversary of Amazing Fantasy number 15, and with the character's unwavering popularity, it's clear that Spider-Man could very well be around for at least another 60 years. But what is it about Spider-Man that makes him such a beloved character? And in turn, how does the finale of Spider-Man the Animated Series capture those elements? First and foremost, what makes Peter Parker so relatable is his internal emotional conflicts. Right from his first appearance, Peter Parker is shown to be a tormented victim of bullies, but also an angry and spiteful young man. Someday I'll show them, Peter says about his bullies in his first appearance. Someday they'll be sorry they laughed at me. He's not a morally flawless person like Superman or Captain America. He often struggles to make the hard choices, but thanks in part to the people around him and the lessons he's learned, he always does the right thing. Farewell Spider-Man is part 2 of a 2-part episode which follows Spider-Man teaming up with a group of multiverse counterparts at the behest of Madame Web. Their mission is to stop a version of Peter that bonded with the Carnage symbiote known as Spider-Carnage. If all this sounds familiar, it's because Farewell Spider-Man is, ostensibly, our first foray into the Spider-Verse, the multi-dimensional concept that is focused entirely on the Spider-Man corner of Marvel Comics. Dan Slott, the writer of the original Spider-Verse miniseries, says the inspiration for the Spider-Verse comic came from his work on the script of the 2010 video game Spider-Man: Shattered Dimensions. However, Farewell Spider-Man was the proof of concept that a multi-dimensional Spider-Man team-up could work. Spider-Man is a famously malleable character who can be dropped into all sorts of scenarios, from grounded street battles with gangsters to cosmic adventures on other planets. But the multiverse is a vast frontier that Spider-Man has never crossed. If Farewell Spider-Man had been a disaster, it might have scared creatives away from ever making a Spider-Verse project again. One of the main reasons for this success is the way the episode uses its characterization of each variant to explore the core aspects of Peter Parker's character. The two variants who receive the most spotlight in this episode are Armor Spider-Man, heretofore referred to as Spider-Armor.
I should be in charge of this group. I'm the real Spider-Man.
And Spider-Carnage.
How I despise you! And for that reason, you must be obliterated.
These two characters sit on opposite ends of the emotional spectrum, with the prime Peter Parker right in the middle. Spider-Armor comes from a world that, at first glance, seems like Peter Parker's dream world. It's a world where Spider-Man is beloved by all, including J. Jonah Jameson. The city builds science centers in his name, and Peter is a wealthy inventor. It's even, as revealed by the end of the episode, a world where Uncle Ben is still alive. For all intents and purposes, this should be Peter Parker's ideal life. However, this is a version of Peter Parker who has not been forged into altruistic heroism by the fires of his many defeats. Spider-Armor is often brash, impulsive, and careless in battle. The episode's writer, John Semper Jr., provides a nuanced approach to the character of Spider-Man that you rarely see. It would be easy to assume that with Uncle Ben still alive, Peter's life would be perfect. But instead, this episode gives us a version of Peter who is still a good hero, but not a truly great one. Without the martyrdom of Uncle Ben and the lessons learned from that tragedy, Peter cannot become the best version of himself. Contrast this with Spider-Carnage, a version of Peter who gave into those selfish, petulant impulses that we glimpsed all the way back in Amazing Fantasy number 15. Spider-Carnage is a Peter Parker who embraced the Carnage symbiote, becoming a twisted version of himself who has abandoned the lessons of Uncle Ben. Additionally, this version of Earth is based on the infamous Spider-Man comic crossover, The Clone Saga, a story that introduced a new character.
My name is Ben Reilly.
Who claimed he was the true Peter Parker, and the one readers had been following for years was actually a clone. The difference on this Earth is that the return of Ben Reilly drives Peter into an identity crisis. So much of Peter's identity is embedded in his relationship with his Uncle Ben. His moral code is defined by the lessons he learned from his uncle, as well as the lessons he learned from the day his uncle died. The minute he believes he could be a clone, all of that introspection is called into question. This lack of understanding of himself makes him seek out the symbiote to give him a purpose again and give up on heroism. Subtextually, Spider-Carnage can be interpreted as a personification of two of the worst Spider-Man stories, The Clone Saga and Maximum Carnage. Both of these stories are the epitome of 90s comic book excess. They were years-long, dragged-out storylines that didn't seem to have any semblance of an ending in sight. A creative nadir for the character who is arguably Marvel Comics' greatest creation. When it's revealed Spider-Carnage wants to destroy all of reality, it becomes a meta-commentary on the way these bloated stories nearly destroyed Spider-Man comics. This makes it all the more appropriate then that the Prime Spider-Man defeats Spider-Carnage by appealing to the base morality that still exists within this dark reflection. Peter sees the same impulses he has struggled with since the death of Uncle Ben, and he reaches out to Spider-Carnage by seeking out the Uncle Ben of Spider-Armor's reality. This version of Uncle Ben reaches out to his misguided nephew and manages to bring back the humanity the symbiote has suppressed.
Do you remember what I taught you about great power?
Yes. With great power, there must come great responsibility.
Here, Uncle Ben is a representation of all that makes Spider-Man great, the simple morality tale of a flawed hero trying to be better. Spider-Carnage then sacrifices himself to save the multiverse, restoring his lost humanity. This sacrifice reaffirms that Spider-Man is a hero defined by his morality, and, most importantly, his flaws. This is what makes a Spider-Verse possible. Each of the Spider people in this episode and beyond represent roads not taken for our favorite webhead, creating the fodder for stories that have sustained for 60 years. The episode ends with a heartwarming meeting between Prime Spider-Man and none other than Stan Lee. Spider-Man, having met so many alternate versions of himself, tells Lee that despite all of the struggles he's faced,
for once, I like my life. I like myself. And for the first time ever, I wouldn't want to change anything about me.
Peter Parker ends the series with peace of mind to know that his life, for all of its troubles, has made him the best version of himself. One must imagine Spider-Man happy and more certain than ever that with great power, there must also come great responsibility.
It has been a long, hard journey, and I think you are finally entitled to some happiness.
Amen to that, dear lady. Amen to that.
From his great triumphs to his great tragedies, everyone can see themselves in Spider-Man. By introducing the multiverse to Spider-Man, we not only come to understand Peter Parker better as a character, but open the door to so many different Spider people to be given the spotlight. The Spider-Verse has grown so much since Farewell Spider-Man aired. Ultimately, what makes this the perfect episode is the way it uses the various Spider characters to explore what makes Peter Parker who he is, and why we all love him. His enduring popularity is rooted in his ability to inspire every one of us, and remind us that, no matter our flaws, we can all be heroes.
The idea was to bring together a group of remarkable people to fight the battles that we never could.
Today, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is inescapable. It's everywhere. Most people are familiar with the fact that these now beloved characters are adaptations from long-running comic book properties. However, in 2008, when Iron Man first debuted on screen,
I'm just not the hero type.
The idea of an interconnected universe, let alone major adaptations of, at the time, B-listers like Thor, Cap, and the Avengers, would have been unthinkable. However, that all changed because of one book, The Ultimates.
I'm here to talk to you about the Avenger Initiative.
The Ultimates, published in March of 2002, was a 13-issue miniseries written by Mark Millar and illustrated by Brian Hitch. A grounded, big-budget sci-fi story with the majestic execution of a Roland Emmerich film and razor-sharp dialogue barreled into comic book stores across the country and was an instant force to be reckoned with. The series was a part of the burgeoning new publishing line that the new head honchos of Marvel were pushing. Out with the 616, in with the Ultimate Universe. Bill Jemas, the former president of the Fleer Trading Card Company, had been handed the reins of Marvel Comics after the company was saved from bankruptcy at the 11th hour. And when Jemas and the freshly minted editor-in-chief Joe Quesada asked indie crime writer Brian Bendis to make an alternate universe continuity-free Spider-Man miniseries aimed at bringing in new readers, it exploded in popularity. The move turned into the longest-running Spider-Man series by one creative team ever, and literally created an entire pocket universe.
There are multiple realities, Peter. This is Earth, Dimension 616.
I'm sorry, you're saying there's a multiverse?
After the runaway success of what was eventually titled Ultimate Spider-Man, Marvel went to young upstart Scottish writer Mark Millar to see if he had a take on an ultimate version of the X-Men. He did. He basically combined the best of early years of the book with a sleek aesthetic of the Fox films.
You actually go outside in these things? What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
Drawn by the Kubert brothers, this book marked hit number 2 for the rapidly developing imprint. So, now Jemas and Quesada had a branding play. Expand these two experiments into an entire line of new reader-friendly titles that would reposition the floundering post-speculator crash company as a force to be reckoned with. Only thing they could have never anticipated is that this single move would be the pivotal moment that would ostensibly guarantee the existence of the MCU. Instead of waiting for screenwriters and directors to decide how a comic character would look on screen, Millar and Hitch decided to make a movie on paper. What this would manifest would be arguably the most important book of the next 20 years. The work they would create would stylistically and narratively undergird almost every decision that Marvel Studios would make.
Going forward in time to see all the possible outcomes. How many did we win? 1.
The Ultimates takes place in the contemporary world of 2002. It follows Nick Fury, drawn as Samuel L. Jackson, as he attempts to put together a team of superheroes in order to defend the Earth from extraterrestrial and domestic threats. And yes, if you're wondering, this is exactly where the idea of Sam Jackson as Nick Fury comes from. While on the press tour for The Ultimates, Millar himself pitched the book as Independence Day with superheroes. And in some ways, it's exactly that. And in others, it's so much more. Issue 1 of The Ultimates opens with a cinematic sequence that shows Cap, during World War II, leading a group of GIs against an Axis power secret hideout, vanquishing the enemy and being frozen in ice. It's hard to communicate just what a deviation this was from the comics of the day. This opening sequence? This was something altogether new. The character that The Ultimates recontextualized the most at the time was Captain America. The book played up his brash and sardonic sense of humor, his superhuman abilities, and toned down the 616 version's Golden Boy Scout perception. It made Cap cool, in the most 2001 way possible. All of these decisions, especially Hitch's Captain America costume designs, filtered straight into the MCU. Sure, they chose to embrace a slightly more light-hearted characterization of Steve Rogers.
That is America's ass.
But the idea of doing a period piece World War II origin movie for Cap is basically just off the strength of the first issue of Ultimates. His fighting style and his relationships with Tony and Thor are right from Ultimates.
Find the scepter. And for gosh sake, watch your language.
In many ways, Steve Rogers is the POV character that we learn about this strange new world through. The book introduces us to Hank Pym, aka Giant Man, Janet Van Dyne, aka Wasp, Iron Man, Hulk, and Thor, all of which are contextualized in a manner that could easily be brought to the screen. Their origins are streamlined, they're drawn in a near photoreal style that mimics that of a camera, and the narrative doesn't use captions, sound effects, or thought balloons. The book only uses narrative mechanics that could be used in a film.
Okay. You ever see this really old movie, Aliens?
And here's the craziest part. After the successes of Ultimate Spidey and X-Men, however, Ultimates would become arguably the biggest comic yet for the Ultimate line. Over the course of the 13 issues, we follow the Ultimates as they put together their team, deal with a rampaging Hulk, and then are finally pitted against an invading alien force in a dazzling showdown unlike anything that had ever been put to the comics page previously. Remember, this is 2002. The Avengers at this time in the standard 616 universe featured classic 4-colored versions of the characters that, believe it or not, had been a middle-tier team for close to 30 years. Brian Hitch's version not only looked like they could be in a movie, they looked like they were the movie version. He was the artist who shaped the aesthetic more than any other since. Yes, Jack Kirby created the Avengers, but Hitch laid out the roadmap for how they and virtually every other character were to be adapted. So what did Marvel do next? They tried to do it again, obviously.
I like it.
I know, it's great, right?
Another!
Debuting in 2004 and concluding in 2007, Ultimates 2 did exactly what they needed it to do. It was a shot in the arm of the Ultimate Universe, and in the brand of Marvel as a whole. This time we follow the Ultimates as they go up against Loki, who takes over the US with a team of superpowered goons known as the Liberators. The biggest difference between the Ultimates universe and the MCU is the handling of Thor. In the 616, he's a god who bonds with a human and fights for the oppressed as soon as he lifts the mighty hammer Mjolnir. In the Ultimates, it's unclear if he's a technologically empowered eco-terrorist with a cult following or an actual god. When it came time to adapt the God of Thunder to the big screen, the powers that be didn't touch any of the alterations that Miller and Hitch had made. They just went straight for the foundation of Kirby and Lee.
So is this how you normally look?
More or less.
It's a good look.
When asked about the Ultimates being the roadmap for the MCU, Miller said, "Our first storyline was basically Independence Day with superheroes, Loki being the villain from our second book. Kevin Feige was a big fan of the books and told us it made him realize an Avengers movie could actually be a lot simpler than they'd thought. But that's not all where the influence of the Ultimates stops. Sam Jackson's Nick Fury showing up at the end of Iron Man, straight from the Ultimates. In The Incredible Hulk, when they throw Bruce Banner from a helicopter in order to get him to change into the Hulk, right from the Ultimates. Cap jumping out of the Quinjet in Winter Soldier without a parachute, directly from the Ultimates.
Before we get started, does anyone want to get out?
But that's not at all where the influence of the Ultimates stops. But those are the pedantic, literal adaptations from the Ultimates. It's really more the aesthetic, the feeling, and the scope of the narrative that the MCU puts forth. It just is the Ultimates. Those two books provided the backbone of an entire multi-billion-dollar industry. They provided the jumping-off point for how to faithfully and accurately adapt 60-year-old characters into the world of today. There was one name that dominated the Cineplex during the 1990s. James Cameron. He had Terminator 2, True Lies, and Titanic all raking in cash and critical acclaim. However, there was almost a very different film in Cameron's 90s output, one that featured a very familiar face. Your friendly neighborhood, Spider-Man.
Spider-Man was always my main man growing up, and I actually rescued that project from the kind of the ash heap.
Currently, Spider-Man's adventures have been ruling the big screen for close to 20 years, but it wasn't always this way. Spidey has been adapted multiple times to the small screen, but the feature film side of Spidey's career had been mired in false starts and missed opportunities. Prior to Cameron coming on board, Spider-Man was being marshaled at Cannon Films under the watchful and usually inept eye of schlocky super producer Menachem Golan. However, Cannon Films was undergoing financial problems, and before anyone knew it, Cannon was out, and the rights to Spider-Man were auctioned off. In 1990, Carolco purchased the rights to make a Spidey feature film from Menachem Golan for $5 million. They were planning on mounting a big-budget feature film version of the character that would have been able to go head-to-head with Tim Burton's Batman franchise. They hired James Cameron to come on board to write, direct, and produce the film. The rough budget was set at a high price tag of $50 million. As Cameron neared completion on True Lies, he started gearing up for Spidey. James Cameron's Spider-Man would be presented to Carolco as a 47-page scriptment. What's a scriptment, you might ask? Well, it's a very detailed outline that's half script and half overview of the story. Cameron's story had a much darker and angsty tone to it than the final Sam Raimi film. It features swearing, hyperviolence, and even Peter Parker pseudo-stalking Mary Jane with his newfound super abilities. The story centers on a surprisingly traditional origin story that then evolves into Spidey going head-to-head with garbled versions of Electro and Sandman. Cameron's scriptment seems to do a pretty good job of updating the classic Lee and Ditko Spider-Man origin for the 1990s. Peter is a nerd. He's into photography and science. Eventually, he gets paired up with Mary Jane Watson on a homework assignment, causing all the teen romantic comedy and unrequited love that you'd want in a Spidey story. Just like in the comics, he goes to a science exhibit, gets bit by a spider, and then gains spider powers. Cameron even takes the teen hijinks and amps it up to 11 by depicting Peter waking up the next morning covered in white organically produced web fluid. That's right, he's all about organic web shooters. Throughout the scriptment, Cameron seems determined to mine the intensity and rawness of being a teenager. He pushes the anger and sexuality in directions that might not always look like they would have worked at face value. This flies in the face of the Spider-Man we all know and love from the comics. Peter's constant struggle in life is balancing a home life, paying rent, and being the superhero New York needs him to be. While the scriptment has some hints at that, it also has a bizarrely try-hard air about it. It wants to be edgy more than it wants to be a good Spider-Man story. Similarly to the source material, Peter is being raised by Aunt May and Uncle Ben, who are kindly but slightly out-of-touch older people. After Ben is laid off from his job, Peter starts attempting to make money as a street performer and local TV show personality. Just like in the classic origin with the wrestling promoter, Peter gets an entertainment agent to handle the money he's making from his appearances. However, he gets screwed over. Then Uncle Ben dies in a carjacking, and Spider-Man tracks down the criminal, finding out that it's all his fault. With great power does, in fact, come great responsibility. This is where the Cameron scriptment starts to diverge significantly from the comics. Peter becomes embroiled in a plot where a rich businessman named Carlton Strand attempts to sway Peter into working for him, ostensibly as a full-time criminal. Strand has the ability to channel electricity. If this sounds familiar, it's because he's essentially just a very boring hybrid of Kroger's brand Kingpin and flea market Electro, but with all the potentially interesting elements of those two characters sanded away. Speaking of sand, the heavy in the film is a character named Boyd, who's got the ability to turn himself into Sandman. He's just Sandman, but again, with none of the backstory or character of Kane Marco. He's just a dude with sand powers. In the finale of the scriptment, Spider-Man defeats Carlton Strand and dumps a massive bag of money over Manhattan. Believe it or not, there's even a sequence in the script that features Spidey and MJ having intimate relations on the Brooklyn Bridge. The aspect that doesn't quite communicate in a summary of the scriptment is just how weirdly filled with cursing it is. Like, Peter and the other characters say curse words throughout the whole thing. There's also some drug use, a significant quotient of over-the-top violence, and a subplot that revolves all around Mary Jane being caught in an abusive relationship. Would the final film have still featured these elements? That's anyone's guess. Treatments and outlines often feature aspects that are discarded before filming. It's clear that Cameron is trying to make a sexier, more Melrose Place version of a Spider-Man mythology, but it doesn't feel right. Spider-Man should be a morality play, not an edgy teen soap opera. James Cameron's Spider-Man film never made it further than this scriptment. Despite rumors of both Leo DiCaprio and Arnold Schwarzenegger's involvement, the project died due to extended litigation. Golan and Cameron were both contractually granted producer credits, and Carolco couldn't get anyone to budge. Thus, lawsuits, battles over financials, and at one point, a Carolco exec literally just phoning up Menachem Golan and point-blank asking him to just not take a credit so they could just move forward with the picture played out throughout the seedy back alleys of Hollywood. Obviously, this didn't happen, and so lawsuits were filed in 1993. Golan sued Carolco, Carolco sued Viacom and Columbia because it turned out that the contract that they bought from Golan only allowed for the feature film rights, and of course, the other two studios countersued. To make things even weirder, Fox, wanting to stay in the James Cameron business, contested Cameron's involvement in Spider-Man, saying that he was under contract to them exclusively. Long story short, it was a mess, and it obviously sank any hopes of a Cameron-written and produced Spider-Man film. Even through all the lawsuit chatter, the fan press and Hollywood were convinced that Leo was going to play Peter Parker. So the question is, how close did we get to actually having Leo on the big screen thwipping around? According to him, not very. In an Empire magazine interview, DiCaprio said he was not very close, but there was a screenplay. But according to Cameron, when talking to Screen Crush, he was very serious about making the film. Superheroes in general always came off as kind of fanciful to me. And believe it or not, the film came closer to existence than anyone probably thinks. Cameron went so far as to lobby Fox to purchase them the rights in the late 90s. I tried to get Fox to buy it, but apparently the rights were a little bit clouded. Former Fox president Peter Chernin just wouldn't go to bat for it. If that doesn't show you James Cameron's artistic and business vision, Nothing will. However, this version of the Spider-Man mythology seems to be better as a link in the chain that eventually resulted in the finished Raimi film than as its own project. The tone of the scriptment is very angry and aggressive in a way that doesn't work for Spider-Man. And the fact that it's not referential to anything in the Spider-Man world other than his origin doesn't sit well. However, the most important element of this scriptment that eventually made its way into David Koepp's Spider-Man screenplay that no one talks about? Organic web shooters.
Whoa! That came out of you.
Yeah, that's right. The organic webs that Peter discovers himself covered in waking up, they manifest throughout the movie as organic web shooters. Their inclusion in the Raimi film can be traced directly back to James Cameron.
Truth is, I am Iron Man.
This moment right here, it's the moment that changed the superhero in the popular consciousness forever. It's the turning point where the superpowered metahumans, mutants, and pseudo-deities that we thrill to evolved into something else. By jettisoning the concept of a secret identity from the superhero archetype, the MCU pushed these beloved characters into something less tethered to reality and distinctly less human.
To force mutants to expose themselves will only further
expose themselves? What is it the mutant community has to hide, I wonder, that makes them so afraid to identify themselves?
I didn't say they were hiding.
Sidekicks, costumes, tragic origins. There are many narrative tropes and genre trappings that have developed since the introduction of the superhero in 1939 with Action Comics #1. The key to making these characters work is something far more subtle than their typically primary colored costumes or extravagant abilities. It's their secret identity. The dichotomy between the regal, empathetic, and bulletproof Superman and meek, mild-mannered Clark Kent.
I guess I must have fainted.
Fainted? You fainted.
Sorry.
Allowed the entire generation of readers to fall in love with the idea of Superman. Secret identities allowed there to be two separate entities at play. Twin personas representing the polar extremes of the protagonist's specific personality flaws or aspirations.
Big man in a suit of armor. Take that off, what are you?
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist.
The real reason that superheroes need secret identities is that it allows their superhero personas to transcend past the daily frictions of the human condition and into a realm of symbol and icon. The way this narrative trope manifests in the stories published by Marvel and DC are widely divergent. DC has a massive, sprawling stable of characters that are, by and large, demigods. People who are born all-powerful or nearly omnipotent, whereas Marvel's characters are usually street-level individuals who are elevated to the level of otherworldly ability. Take, for example, the idea of how Clark Kent is dealt with. He's essentially a fictional persona that Superman dons in order to seamlessly move through the human world. Superman is the real person, Clark Kent is the performance. It's how he sees us. It's his empathetic satire on how difficult it must be to be human. Similarly, Batman is the real person. Bruce Wayne is the performance. However, Bruce uses his fake persona of a foppish playboy to shield himself from undue scrutiny that might suss out his true intentions. Conversely, Marvel characters use their secret identities to escape the new world they find themselves in. Being a teenager is hard, but it's a welcome respite for Peter Parker when he's been dealing with the world-ending consequences of being on the new Avengers. The true narrative function of secret identities is to facilitate the separation of an individual's personal history from the tenets of morality that the hero purports to exemplify. This is represented visually by a literal icon on the chest of the hero, more often than not. Think about the X-Men for a second. They're tasked with protecting a world that hates and fears them. If they didn't have secret identities to hide behind, life would get a hell of a lot more complicated for them, which, when it came time to adapt them to the big screen, is an idea that kinda got thrown out. No one ever really seems all that concerned with who the individual members of the X-Men are in the movies. They just generally hate and fear the idea of mutants.
Have you tried not being a mutant?
But in the comics, mutant symbolism is used regularly as a call to arms, a cultural rallying cry, or even as a means by which to violate civil liberties. Symbology in superhero stories is intricately intertwined with the character's history. So much so, it even made it into one of Bruce Wayne's speeches in Batman Begins.
As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, I can be destroyed, but as a symbol,
as a symbol that can be incorruptible.
But here's where the cultural prominence of these characters and their inextricable link to how we process power and wish fulfillment in our culture has shifted since the first Iron Man film in 2008. The MCU has largely jettisoned the idea that superheroes need secret identities. All of the Avengers are publicly known. Do they have code names? Yes.
I'm Peter, by the way.
Doctor Strange.
Oh, you're using your made-up names. I'm Spider-Man, then.
But they don't have the personas that those names shield. The general public is aware that Captain America is Steve Rogers, that Natasha Romanoff is Black Widow, and that the Hulk is Bruce Banner. The MCU has done away with the idea of secret identities so thoroughly that Thor's alternate self, Donald Blake, literally has never made an on-screen appearance, other than as the name of Thor's fake driver's license in the first Thor film. So why is this? Well, initially, it didn't seem to be an intentional choice. The climax of Iron Man 1 shows Tony being told that he should pretend that the Iron Man suit is actually his bodyguard.
It's a bodyguard? He's my body? I mean, that's kind of flimsy, don't you think?
And then choosing to forgo that by admitting to everyone that he is Iron Man. This choice was made to boil close to 40 years of Iron Man continuity down into a few lines, and move on to where the character was current day as a public futurist. However, after the rampant success of Iron Man, this same creative approach was given to all of the Avengers. The fact that Hulk, essentially a domestic terrorist with a big case of the Jekyll and Hydes, is just welcomed with open arms into the staff of an unregulated, superpowered governing body is surreal and bizarre. The MCU versions of a lot of these characters are almost viewed as celebrity CEOs, and a few of them, like Tony, Bruce, and Hank Pym, are literally celebrity CEOs. The character of Superman comes from a time when the ravages of depression, racism, and street violence were real fears. His creation as a bulletproof man was sparked from the tragic fact that Superman's co-creator Jerry Siegel's father died of a heart attack during a convenience store robbery. Clark Kent is the emotional core of those ideas. It's not only an endearing metaphor of how Kal-El sees us, but what we should expect from people in positions of power.
You will give the people of Earth an ideal to strive towards.
Without this core, the character could easily veer into dystopian and deeply disturbing interpretations. And in some ways, that's a problem for a lot of the MCU characters. They rarely have a deeper, complex relationship with humanity. They want to protect us because that's the right thing to do, but it doesn't come from an individualistic connection. As their secret identities have been stripped, so has their inner connection to mankind. Cap is a perfect character to explore how America has evolved throughout the last 60 years that he was frozen in the ice, but he never really struggles with the contemporary world, outside of filling a notebook with stray movie titles he needs to catch up on. And that's largely because Steve and Cap are the same person. If they were two separate personas, the narrative possibilities are endless. Instead, whenever Cap isn't at home in the modern world or at odds with contemporary ideals, he just dons a hoodie and a baseball cap and tries to blend in. None of this is to say that the MCU's adaptation of these characters are bad. They're not. In fact, by and large, they've been more fidelitous and accurate to their four-color counterparts than the DC ones have. However, with the removal of secret identities, the MCU versions of these characters have become something else. A new breed of character, one that serves simultaneously as a standard bearer for American ideals, a harbinger of death for a traditional filmic experience, and a masthead for a new age, the Disney era. These characters, who were created by oppressed citizens of the lower class, are now emblematic of the issues that come when power is allowed to run amok unchecked.
He stinks, and I don't like him.
They dominate the box office, pushing out every other type of media, and simultaneously are becoming more homogenous by the day. The filmmakers that are hired to work on these characters aren't interested in cementing a symbolic call to arms that future generations will look to as an example of moral rectitude. The army of people with a simple goal. Make something that the masses will love and want to consume. There's an argument to be made that you can do both, but the key is to have these characters have a deep connection to humanity, to have a superhero persona that is a symbol shining in the darkness. And to do that, you need a secret identity. Sony's initial Sam Raimi-driven Spider-Man trilogy held the mantle as the reigning champion of the superhero movie genre for a long time. However, a lot has changed about the art of making comic book films in the intervening 20 years, a fact that somehow seems lost on Sony executives with their repeated attempts at launching a cinematic universe.
I'm not sure how I got here.
Has to do with Spider-Man, I think. I think a bunch of guys like us should team up.
Cast your minds back before every intellectual property known to man had a cinematic universe connected to it. Despite Spider-Man 3 being a box office smash, Sony announced it was abandoning plans for a Spider-Man 4 starring Toby Maguire. This would obviously give way to the two Amazing Spider-Man movies starring Andrew Garfield.
Spider-Man.
During the lead-up to the premiere of Amazing Spider-Man, superhero mega-producer Avi Arad discussed the potential of having a solo Venom franchise outside of these new Spider-Man films, making this the first stutter step toward the shared and connected filmic universe featuring villains of the old webhead. This plan was further expanded with the release of Amazing Spider-Man 2, which was intended to lay the groundwork for a network of films, the initial two supposedly being Venom and a Sinister Six film. Needless to say, Amazing Spider-Man 2 failed at the box office, leading everyone at Sony to rethink this direction. And a mere 2 years later, Marvel stepped in to take Spider-Man back under control for Captain America: Civil War.
Captain? Big fan of Spider-Man?
Yeah, we'll talk about it later. Just...
Hey, everyone.
Good job.
And here's where our story splits in two halves. On one half, we have the MCU Spidey films and mega producer Amy Pascal's efforts to develop a potential animated Spider-Man project. And on the other hand, we have the eventual shared universe of Spider-less villain films. 2016 saw Avi Arad and Matt Tolmach back in the producing seats, bringing Venom to the big screen. This time as a solo character, with an eye on building a universe around him.
We are Venom.
Venom might be a symbiote from an alien world, but in the comics, most of the character's actual powers come from the time he was bonded to Peter Parker. Venom's origin, his motivation, and his powers are all tied directly to a character Sony couldn't really use. So what do you do? Well, logically, you'd probably start with the idea of making a tragic downfall of a journalist consumed with jealousy. That's not what Sony opted for. Instead, it's a movie about Tom Hardy doing a funny voice and fighting with himself.
You are a loser, Eddie.
And you know what? Surprisingly, this thing worked. Well, at least on the financial front. Believe it or not, the movie that's been in on-again, off-again development since the 90s actually demolished at the box office. It pulled in approximately $856 million worldwide. Avi Arad's dreams were finally coming true, a shared universe of Spider films. But now, with the bizarre restriction of still not having Spider-Man.
What if everyone forgot who I was?
What?
This time make everyone forget who Peter Parker is.
We'd have no memory of you. It would be as though you never existed.
Out of this situation, a flurry of announcements happened after having been put on the back burner. Chief among them were a supposed Night Watch film that Spike Lee was going to direct, a Black Cat and Silver Sable team-up film, and a reworked version of the Sinister Six. Obviously, none of these films ever came to be. What we got instead was more of the same, but with an added sprinkling of Woody Harrelson.
Shut your mouth.
Venom, Let There Be Carnage, is one of the most phoned-in and by-the-number superhero sequels ever produced. This snooze fest would have been a lot more fun if Harrelson actually looked like a psychotic clown the whole runtime. But you know what? It didn't matter. It made a ton of money. Over $500 million to be precise. That being said, at least the film is only 96 minutes long. And if you thought this movie was a low point for global culture, you missed the next entry into the Spider-Man villain universe.
I am Venom.
April 1st, 2022 saw the release of the much-delayed and obviously heavily re-edited Morbius. This film just failed to sink its teeth into anything substantial at the box office, pulling in only $167 million worldwide. But here's the kicker. Morbius is the only theatrically released feature film to fail twice. That's right. After the film bombed the first time, the internet did what the internet does and mercilessly made fun of the film, giving Michael Morbius the fake catchphrase, "It's Morbin time." Attempting to capitalize off the memification of the poor quality of the film, they re-released it into theaters only for literally no one to show up again. It failed epically. Both Venom films feel like coldly calculated movies from directors looking to have a boost to their careers, while Morbius just feels like a miscast story told by someone who had absolutely no passion for what they're attempting to say. And now here we are, staring down the barrel of 3 more movies set in this universe: Kraven the Hunter, Venom 3, and a Madam Web film. all of these are supporting characters and don't have a reason to exist outside of being a foil for some aspect of Spider-Man's personality. So, when you remove Spider-Man, what are you trying to tell a story about?
Now that Spider-Man's gone, the city will never be the same.
If Morbius and Venom were released in the early 2000s alongside Daredevil, Ang Lee's Hulk, and Ghost Rider, they would feel absolutely at home. Studios were still somewhat unsure of how faithfully they should be adapting the tried and true trappings of the superhero genre. No bright colors, no spandex, and no big ideas for the universe that the heroes lived in. That's exactly how all these Sony Spider-Villains films feel. They're stuck being self-conscious adaptations of characters that don't need to have $200 million poured into them. And Kraven might be the best example of this phenomenon.
He is weak, like his mother. Leave him.
Venom? Huge fan base. He's even been an anti-hero during his Lethal Protector era. Morbius? Sure, you could probably find some way of making a cool Blade-esque or Dracula in modern times movie out of that character. But Kraven? He's got one attribute. He's a hunter. His motivation is to take down the most dangerous prey. The movie they're trying to convince us to go see? He's a super-powered vigilante. It's Dexter meets the Manimal. He has the ability to absorb animal powers and then he hunts criminals. No, that's not a Kraven movie. That's a movie produced by people who don't care or like the character. If you don't know the source material, maybe don't make it into a movie.
You're a goddamn lunatic.
Oh, you just figured that out now?
And it's not going to be slowing down anytime soon. There are reports that as many as 8 new Spider-Villain movies are currently in active development. The 2 we currently know the most about are a Donald Glover project centering on Hypno Hustler and a movie about El Muerto, which at one time was set to star Bad Bunny. Sony isn't attempting to accomplish anything other than to pick up the scraps that the MCU and the DCU leave behind. Their cynicism is evident over every frame of these films, and apparently, it's financially successful for them. It's just a tragedy that these characters and audience are the ones truly suffering.
And they found you amusing for a while. But the one thing they love more than a hero is to see a hero fail, fall, die trying.
Man, what a weird scene. And why is Green Goblin's mask so terrible? Sure, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy might as well be considered the contemporary Rosetta Stone to unlocking the superhero blockbuster world we live in today, but it has one flaw that's still viewed as a cultural punching bag to this day. And no, it's not that emo dance. It's that dang Green Goblin mask.
Oh my god.
Spider-Man's path to the big screen was anything but a straight line. From his 60s animated show and 70s live-action appearances to close calls with filmmakers like James Cameron and Albert Pune, it can be difficult to remember today, but cracking the code of how to make superhero films work in live action took a considerable amount of effort. The comic book explosion of the 2000s saw every sort of visual solution being thrown at the beloved 4-colored characters of yore, but the most tried and true solution was to tone down the potentially campy or garish color palettes of the characters in question and drop them into a world that was more serious and dour. Remember, even Tim Burton's almost produced Superman Lives would have taken the big blue Boy Scout and turned him into an all-black suited hero sporting a mullet. If that doesn't tell you how much the studio execs were scared of spandex and bright colors, nothing will.
Time to give the devil his due.
And against that narrative backdrop, in comes Sam Raimi. Die-hard Spider-Man fan and, at the time, the least likely human alive to direct a massive blockbuster. Don't forget, Raimi, originally known for his oddball horror comedies, was in something of a journeyman era. After suffering a few very public failures, he chose to pivot into directing a spiritual trilogy of semi-lifeless studio pictures, obviously produced in the attempt to convince the industry at large that he wasn't a one-trick pony.
I told you to stay off this set and never come back. I love that. I love it.
He wanted to communicate that he could be a competent director who didn't need to rely on slapstick comedy, hyper-stylized visuals, or gross-out horror. Did The Gift, For the Love of the Game, and A Simple Plan accomplish this goal? Yeah, they did. Did they leave a terrible, deep cultural groove? No. However, playing it safe and making some films that were less than enticing to his small but dedicated core audience paid off in the long term. Because Raimi, after meeting with future mega producer Avi Arad, landed the gig of a lifetime, directing the live-action version of his favorite comic book character, the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Raimi is largely to credit with multiple rounds of rewrites that refocus the story on Peter Parker's daily trials and tribulations. These new drafts pulled in complex social dynamics,
computer salesman, computer engineer, computer analyst. My lord, even the computers need analysts these days.
And kept the emotional life of the characters grounded while allowing the more operatic elements of the story to sing. Raimi was also the man behind keeping the now iconic Spider-Man suit largely the same as its comic book counterpart. It sounds like a foregone conclusion that the film version of Spider-Man's costume would look like the Steve Ditko designed ensemble, but stranger things have happened. When the film was first announced, fans were up in arms about the idea that Spider-Man's web-slinging sequences were largely going to be computer-generated. That almost seems unthinkable, doesn't it? Modern Marvel films have more CGI than actual practical photography. Times were different then. And even though we ultimately got a great costume, that wasn't always the plan. Multiple design paths were explored in an attempt to figure out what the best look would be for Spidey's big screen debut. In fact, acclaimed illustrator Alex Ross designed a drastically different suit that was even made and screen tested before the suit we know and love was eventually selected. Today, everyone knows that the Raimi Spider-Man suit was a huge step forward in legitimizing the aesthetics of superhero movies. It was the first pseudo-spandex costume to pull in large audiences since Richard Donner's Superman. The Spider-Man suit that eventually graced the silver screen felt both contemporary and timeless. Is it a little weird that his eye shields look like he's frowning constantly? Yes, sure. But its raised silver webbing and Gore-Tex aesthetic gave it the credibility and believability that it and the genre overall desperately needed. Conversely, we have this abomination.
Hello, my dear.
They say your hero is only as good as their villain, but thankfully that axiom doesn't apply to costume design. Why did they choose this rigid Power Rangers-looking ribbed jazzercise outfit? Who knows? They couldn't even come up with an in-universe reason why Green Goblin dons the costume in the first place. But the worst part of it is the mask. It's unmoving and structured, and its weird retractable eye shields are endlessly vexing. And to make matters worse, we could have had this. Yes, that's right. Studio ADI, the company that was responsible for designing both the Alien and the Predator's on-screen appearances, created a more comic book accurate look for Norman Osborn's nefarious alter ego. Green Goblin's core visual traits are his maniacal laugh and ghoulish grin. The existing mask tried to play off that idea, however, since there's literally no emotion there, it just leaves the viewers cold. Whereas this test footage could have propelled Willem Dafoe's already iconic turn as the character into something utterly genre-shattering. This design looks like it might have been an offshoot of the potential designs that Alex Ross did for the film, mixed with the designs that concept artists Tevz and James Carson did. This design could have been the godsend that this character needed. Goblin and Osborn are such emotionally unhinged characters that choosing to create an unmoving mask was a big misstep for the film. And it seems apparent that everyone involved in the film knew that the performance of Osborn was going to be an integral part of the project. So much so that most of the other concept art that's been revealed since the film's release, like James Carson's full body paintings or concept artist Warren Manser's mask sketches, all have a focus on revealing the face. Frankly, the fact that they didn't go with the more outlandish green-skinned face is a perfect sign of the times. Raimi could only fight so many battles, and this Green Goblin battle was just not one he was going to win. The studio obviously wanted the villain to reflect visually the militarism of the scripted backstory, and so they opted for the mask we all know. The Goblin mask has become such a cultural punching bag that when Dafoe returned for the MCU version of his iconic villain, they literally shattered it so he wouldn't have to wear it throughout the film. When asked about it on the No Way Home press tour, Willem Dafoe told the New York Times, "I must be honest, I am aware that there was some criticism of that mask in the original one. We heard it enough that it was probably a consideration to change it up a little bit. I don't think about that because I don't think about emoting with my face." This is how far we've come. In the early 2000s, it was a feat just to convince a studio executive that anyone would want to see a movie based on a comic book. Now, we're putting Easter eggs in the film as responses to the fandom's opinions of characters' costume designs. In fact, in recent years, this debate about the Goblin's design has continued to be such a hot topic that James Atchison, the original costume designer, told Cinema Blend, "The trouble about all these costumes is that the process of making them are exhausting. And if somebody says, no, I don't want that, you've got to retread your steps because of the processes of casting and painting them. and you can see that decision fatigue in the Goblin's design. Raimi obviously couldn't win the fight, so he just moved on. That being said, if there was an area to compromise on, it was this. Spider-Man and its sequels would be a massive step forward in the superhero genre. Ultimately, we all owe Sam Raimi and his team a massive thank you. And hopefully, next time Green Goblin rears his ugly head, we get him looking much more like this than like that.
Who the hell are you? Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D. I'm here to talk to you about the Avenger Initiative.
Remember this? Obviously, it changed the movie industry forever, but maybe not in the way you're thinking. Today, the MCU is the most dominant form of filmmaking on the planet, and as such, this cute Easter egg idea of storing secret information after the end credits of a film has caught on, and it's the perfect symbol for everything wrong with Hollywood today.
But I think a bunch of guys like us should team up and do some good.
Intriguing.
Sure, Iron Man is what everyone thinks of when they talk about post-credit scenes, but it wasn't the first by a long shot. In fact, the very first time a film ever had a post-credit scene was the Dean Martin spy film The Silencers from 1966. The movie in question is an attempt to capitalize off the rampant popularity of the James Bond franchise. Every Bond film ends with a post-credit message saying, "James Bond will return." So, not to be outdone by this, The Silencers features a post-credit sneak peek at the sequel, titled Murderer's Row. However, this film might as well be lost to the sands of time by today's standards. There were many other films that featured post-credit scenes over the ensuing 40 years. Masters of the Universe, Airplane, The Muppet Movie, to name a few. But it would be Ferris Bueller's Day Off that would cement the idea into the public consciousness.
You're still here? It's over.
The scene is as iconic today as when it was first released. So much so that Deadpool even parodied it.
Oh, you're expecting a teaser for Deadpool 2. Well, we don't have that kind of money.
Despite being the secret weapon of the film industry, the post-credit sequence wouldn't fully catch on until it was embraced by the first wave of Marvel films. In fact, all of the press and preview screenings of 2008's Iron Man did not feature the now infamous post-credit scene that linked Tony Stark to a wider world of superheroes. From there, the MCU would use the post-credit sequence as a way to build hype for their upcoming projects. Thanos was introduced in the post-credit scene of the first Avengers movie, and the stakes were raised when he donned the Infinity Gauntlet at the end of Age of Ultron. As the first three phases of the MCU marched toward the finale of Infinity War and Endgame, the post-credit scenes worked more or less in concert with one another to layer the key pieces of narrative real estate. They built anticipation about the ultimate showdown between the Avengers and Thanos with the fate of the universe at hand. There was a storyline building through all the films and a figurehead that was easily identifiable for both the casual fan and the hardcore alike.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
But the problem wasn't just Marvel. Other films started to use these post-credit scenes with the intent on building anticipation for their future releases and sequels, but they didn't go nearly as well. Look at what Marvel's direct competition DC attempted to do. The original ending of the theatrical release of Justice League ended with Deathstroke and Lex Luthor meeting on a yacht, teasing the establishment of the DCEU's Legion of Doom.
He and his odd little friends are forming some sort of league. Shouldn't we have a league of our own?
That went nowhere. The same thing can be said for DC's post-credit attempts with Shazam, Wonder Woman 1984, Black Adam, and Suicide Squad, even going as far back as DC's first attempt at starting an interconnected universe, Green Lantern. Their tease of the Sinestro Corps landed about as well as everything else in that movie.
Ah, Green! Wow. I know, right?
Literally, every one of these setups went nowhere or were immediately abandoned by the corporate overlords, making the entire convention of post-credit scenes feel less cool and unique and more just like something the filmmakers had to do out of obligation.
You better not be wasting my time.
No, I have too much to live for.
As we move deeper into the 2010s, even non-superhero fare like the Monsterverse, G.I. Joe, and Fast and Furious tried to get in on the post-credits party. Most of this is pretty awful, and here's where we get back to Marvel, where the idea of sitting through yet another 15-minute long credit sequence seems less preferable than just getting up and walking out of the theater. By the end of Phase 4, the post-credits hype machine has run its course. There doesn't seem to be any real connectivity or direction for the next three phases of the MCU. The post-credit scene at the end of Thor: Love and Thunder, that's gone basically nowhere. Star Fox in the end of The Eternals, don't expect that to show up anytime soon. The Doctor Strange post-credit scene, well, that one might be the worst of all.
You caused an incursion, and we're gonna fix it.
On the surface, the introduction of Clea and the confirmation that we're officially heading towards Secret Wars should be exciting. But it's not a clear narrative path in the way that Thanos was communicated to audiences. It's just a portal opening up and Doctor Strange being told there's more adventure in store. And to make things worse, it completely nullifies the ending of the movie we just watched. Why did we just spend 2 hours with Stephen Strange to have his growth as a character and the crucial consequence for his hubris hand-waved away in 2 seconds? The MCU's obsession with expanding ever outwards is reaching a breaking point. Sony has their very own universe of Spider-Man-less films, and their post-credit scenes are without a doubt the most painful and not at all thought out. The key example being the stinger for Morbius. The sequence shows an incursion happening, and then the Vulture appearing in a prison cell. We quickly see his release, and then a middle-of-nowhere rendezvous with Morbius.
Thanks for meeting me, Doc. I've been reading about you.
I'm listening.
I'm not sure how I got here. Has to do with Spider-Man, I think.
There's no way there's any sort of grander plan for the Sony Spider universe of cash grabs. You can just feel it on every level. So not only was this tacked onto a terrible movie, but it's a terrible setup for a definitely non-existent plan for a future Sinister Six film. It's just insulting on every level. And that's the problem with all these current post-credit scenes. They're not included because the filmmakers have a grander vision like the original Iron Man stinger. They're included because the corporate powers that be want everyone to think there's a grander vision at hand. Take for instance the most recent Transformers soft reboot. In that post-credit scene, they set up the idea that the Transformers are going to be joining a secret governmental agency named
G.I. Joe.
Will that actually ever happen? Is there a plan for a Transformers and G.I. Joe crossover movie? No, definitely not. G.I. Joe has been screwed up each of the 3 times it's been on the big screen already. There's no way anyone would put any forethought or planning into this project. Even Marvel is completely out of gas when it comes to generating hype via post-credit scenes. When the Marvels started tracking at only $70 million for its opening weekend, what did they do? Include a new post-credit scene featuring a major Marvel character that is seemingly only there to keep us on the hook for future installments. Not every film is meant to launch an interconnected universe, and similarly, not every installment in said universes are going to have sky-high stakes, and yet these studios can't afford that. They want every possible dollar wrung out of every potential moviegoer. Thus, the post-credit and mid-credit scenes are required to generate as much excitement for future stories as possible.
You expecting Sam Jackson show up with an eye patch and a saucy little leather number? Go.
We need to face it. In-credit surprises have run their course. They're played out and they've been abused by every single movie with delusions of launching a franchise. Is there a time or a place when they can be used effectively? Of course, but not every movie needs one. There's only one problem. Things are only going to get worse. Even beloved indie studio A24 seems to be chasing the franchise money just like everyone else, purportedly trying to get out of the auteur-driven space and into the more IP-driven big-budget realm of filmmaking. So what's the lesson to learn from any of this? Too much of a good thing isn't good. And if you want a diverse selection of films to be made, you need to support them. Maybe when Kraven finally gets released, don't go see it. Sony doesn't need your money, and at the end of the day, we already know the post-credit scene is going to suck.
You killed my mother, my father. You're slave. You're weak.
Have you noticed how all the recent Marvel TV shows feel like they're just bad? They all seem to be wandering and meandering slogs to get through, right? Well, that might be because, for the last few years, the behind the scenes of Marvel television has been nothing short of a mess. For close to a decade, the MCU dominated the box office and the movie-going public's hearts. Then, things started to falter. Now we're living under what feels like a near avalanche of film and TV projects set inside the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Some of these stories have been great, but the overwhelming majority of the post-in-game fare have been uneven, to say the least. The lack of quality surrounding these projects, and specifically the MCU's TV shows, have poured jet fuel on growing feelings of resentment and restlessness with Marvel fans.
This is a mess. None of these storylines make any sense.
So is this the end of the MCU as we know it? No, not in the slightest. In fact, Marvel brass is very aware of the fact that their stranglehold on global culture is slipping, and they're making moves to restructure their TV production pipeline as we speak. For a little context, the Disney Plus era of the MCU might as well be considered Marvel TV 2.0 for all it bears in similarity to the original Netflix and ABC shows. Why is that? Well, because Marvel Television, a subsidiary of Marvel Studios, was literally created in 2010 to capitalize off of the success of the mainline MCU movies by ostensibly one man, Ike Perlmutter.
Marvel Television is a brand new venture, and something that I'm extremely excited about.
He pushed the creation of a TV division through over the objections of Kevin Feige, who was worried about this exact problem, a watering down of the brand. TV and film are two separate beasts and move at completely different paces. Maintaining a cohesive universe of stories where there are two different rates of churn is an almost impossible task, which is why the Inhumans, Agent Carter, the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., as well as the Netflix shows like Jessica Jones, Daredevil, and The Defenders were kinda kept off in their own little circle. Continuity really only flowed one way, from the movies to the shows, never the other way around.
I'm sorry, this is a mistake. I gotta go.
Hey, where?
I can't be a part of this.
If you ask me, you already are.
Due to the resounding success of Endgame, Feige was handed the reins to both the TV and film sides of the MCU. This was something that initially seemed like it was for the best. We would now get fully integrated TV and film characters. The originally announced slate of projects included both a Scarlet Witch TV show and a Falcon and Winter Soldier project. They also rapidly announced that the shows would take a more extended movie approach to story creation by building out these shows as miniseries as opposed to ongoing continuing narratives. This seemed like a smart way to stop the scope creep that Kevin Feige was originally worried about and debut with a splash. Big-name actors, fan-favorite characters, and a production model that seemed both shrewd and sustainable.
So you're saying the universe created a sitcom starring two Avengers?
It's a working theory.
However, too much of a good thing is never good. It quickly became apparent that Disney needed a constant and steady stream of MCU-branded content to keep their newly debuted platform relevant during the early days of the streaming wars. This ultimately resulted in too many shows being greenlit and not enough time or energy going into making sure that these projects actually could stand on their own 2 feet. The most recent releases of the MCU's mixed track record of small-screen adventures is the program Secret Invasion, which received a wildly negative response, and Loki Season 2, which has been more positively received. And yet the same critiques that plague many MCU shows are being proffered about both of these projects. Weird pacing, meandering story, and a general feeling that things are either rushing to a climax or wasting time on stuff no one cares about.
What a waste of time.
In a recent article released by The Hollywood Reporter, we may have gotten a reason for those stylistic inconsistencies and almost universally consistent flaws. Marvel's production pipeline is drastically different from everyone else in Tinseltown. Marvel doesn't shoot pilots, they don't write show bibles, and they don't even hire showrunners. They basically just left the writer's room to construct the shows, almost without supervision in a traditional sense. Then they spent $150 million creating the shows episode by episode as if they were one extremely long film. How did they fix things that weren't working, you might ask? Highly expensive rewrites and reshoots, just like you would on a film, not like TV productions are typically handled.
I don't understand what's happening, why it's all falling apart, and why I can't fix it.
This method came to the fore during the production of the high-profile reboot of everyone's favorite superheroic blind lawyer, Daredevil, Born Again. As you'll remember, the writers and the actors' strike started in May and July respectively. Due to this work stoppage, Marvel execs reviewed the footage from Born Again and were not pleased with what they were seeing. The proposed 18-episode series was intended to be the return of Charlie Cox's beloved incarnation of the demon of Hell's Kitchen to a new plateau of glory. Only, according to sources in the know, he literally didn't put on his costume until episode 4. Supposedly, the first 4 episodes were playing into the exact tropes of what fans were complaining about.
Where did you come up with that original idea? Was that from every other superhero story?
This, along with the internal discussions, has caused Marvel to upend the way that they've been producing TV. They're completely overhauling it. They're abandoning everything they've shot of Born Again, fired head creators Chris Ord and Matt Corman, and are releasing the directors for the rest of the season from their commitments. From here on out, they're going to be making Bibles, pilots, and shooting in a more traditional TV production method. They're also going to be refocusing on making traditionally structured shows as opposed to miniseries style shows. With that in mind, they brought in a new head writer and showrunner for Daredevil, Dario Scardapane, a former journalist and former showrunner of NBC's Trauma and FX's The Bridge. On the surface, this pivot might seem like a drastic solution to a bizarrely ethereal problem, and yet, it's one that bodes well for the MCU. Maybe they can stop trying to reinvent the wheel and focus on making stories that aren't worried about filling in the gaps in between movies and instead have an actual internal narrative engine all their own.
Sometimes it's okay to destroy something.
If there's a hope that you can replace that thing with something better.
What this signals over anything else is the fact that the people in charge of the MCU know they're slipping, and they're attempting to pivot back to what could work. Audiences are tired of the high-volume output, the films all feeling cookie-cutter, and many of the beloved and iconic characters having been retired. If Marvel were truly listening, they'd say, we're going to shut it down for a bit post-Secret Wars and eventually come back for more when the time is right. But that won't happen. There's just too much money on the line. Ultimately, the MCU isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So the important aspect of the revelation that even they know the TV side hasn't been working is that they're committed to trying to fix things. Let's just hope that in frantically attempting to mend things, they don't make everything worse, like greenlighting more Moon Knight.
I'm trying to keep you from tearing the Avengers apart. You did that when you signed.
Captain America: Civil War was a defining turning point in the trajectory of the MCU. It pits hero against hero.
He's my friend. So was I.
And asks a simple question. Where does individual freedom end and public safety begin? Or at least that's what it wants you to think it's about. However, there seems to be a larger problem with this film that, even now 7 years later, no one wants to talk about.
This isn't gonna change what happened. I don't care.
Be warned, spoilers for Civil War, both the comic and the film, are incoming. The conflict of Captain America: Civil War theoretically centers around a simple concept. Should superpowered individuals be forced to have governmental oversight? That's also the high concept of the 2006 Marvel Comics crossover Civil War that the movie is loosely based on. In the film, we follow multiple intertwining plot threads that all coalesce around Captain America attempting to defend his longtime friend Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier, despite his assassin past. Other forces led by Iron Man are attempting to bring the rogue entity, who was formerly under the control of the Soviet Union, to justice by any means necessary. This is all told against the backdrop of a push from the global community to pass what are deemed the Sokovia Accords, ostensibly a meta-human registration act.
A great many people see you as heroes. There are some who would prefer the word vigilantes.
Here's the thing, Captain America: Civil War is a great superhero movie. It's a rollicking good time, and it initially seems like it wants to interrogate these large ideas on a deeper level, to push further than being a fun popcorn movie. But because of the requirements of making a blockbuster, they couldn't make it feel like a trial episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. So, what did they do? They made the story more personal.
Sometimes I want to punch you in your perfect teeth. But I don't want to see you gone. We need you, Cap.
They centered it on Cap's relationship with Bucky, and they made the Winter Soldier a MacGuffin that everyone's after. The idea of the Sokovia Accords is a fascinating setup for a film. Too bad the finished picture has almost no interest in delving deeper into it than just using the idea as texture for blink and you miss it world building.
Is that how you see this? This is protection? It's internment,
She's
Tony.
not a U.S. citizen, and they don't grant visas to weapons of mass destruction.
She's a kid.
Give me a break!
But let's go back to 2006. The book follows the struggles of two warring factions of superheroes who find themselves on opposite sides of a new law, the Superhuman Registration Act. You see, after a villain named Nitro accidentally blows up an entire school, killing roughly 600 people, the public discourse around the ethics of superheroics in the 616 shifts dramatically. The Registration Act requires anyone with superpowers to come forward, reveal their secret identity, receive training, and if they choose to continue fighting crime, to work for the federal government. This law fractures the superhero community, with one faction, the anti-registration crowd, perceiving the required governmental oversight and employment as an infringement on their rights. The other faction, the pro-registration team, view it as a necessity to keep the public safe. However, the main through line is Captain America and his anti-registration compatriots are on the run from Iron Man, who has taken over as the head of both the pro-registration movement and, ultimately, S.H.I.E.L.D. itself.
Congratulations, Cap. You're a criminal.
As you can see, this is a very politically volatile setup. The story is deeply rooted in the post-9/11 ideals of safety and freedom that America was grappling with, and arguably still is. The SRA might as well be the Patriot Act for comic book characters.
Our very strength invites challenge. Challenge incites conflict. And conflict breeds catastrophe.
The finale of the story underscores just where America was at the time. During the climactic battle in New York City, Cap wins a one-on-one fight with Iron Man, giving him the opportunity to end things once and for all. But the Sentinel of Liberty is overwhelmed by local civilians. The story ends with Cap's idealism being tarnished and Iron Man's more authoritarian outlook winning the day, aided by the will of a terrified people. It's a bleak ending that showcases how mob mentality and the fear of the unknown can drive people to vote against their best interest. That sometimes we willfully strip ourselves of inalienable rights under the promise of the ever-mercurial idea of security. How are these ideas manifested in the movie version? A central component to the underlying metaphor is conflating individual freedoms with the right to have a secret identity. However, in the MCU, most heroes don't have secret identities.
I am Iron Man.
Therefore, some liberal changes needed to transpire. The film takes the perspective that we're going to follow the effect that the heroes have had on the world, as opposed to the political temperature of the world informing or pushing the heroes in a specific direction. Due to this, there's an emphasis placed on the civilian casualties. This is represented by both the collateral damage during Crossbone's self-immolation and the bombing of the UN. The film asks, to what degree are these heroes morally culpable? And yet, as previously mentioned, it's more there for a sense of world building than actually a central dynamic. The movie attempts to make these larger concepts personal and give them a face.
He decided to spend his summer building sustainable housing for the poor, guess where? Sokovia. He wanted to make a difference, I suppose. I mean, we won't know because we dropped a building on him while we were kicking ass.
The biggest sense of differentiation between the book and the movie is how the central conflict is resolved. The tagline for the book was, "Whose side are you on?" Whereas the film slogan, "United we stand, divided we fall," is more centered on the fact that there is a conflict, not actually which side should win. In the book, at the outset, both Tony and Steve have valid points, and for the majority of the story, their perspectives are valid. Towards the climax, the population sides with Tony in that registration is a good thing, but the book sides with Steve, making the ending a dour conclusion. Despite the will of the people prevailing, we have chosen a darker path. In the movie, all that nuance is lost. There's the ultimate reveal that Bucky killed Iron Man's father, and Steve knew about it but never told Tony, thus sparking a knockdown, drag-out fight between the three of them in the highly emotional finale. And while this sequence inarguably works on a character level, on a story level, it doesn't push the greater MCU anywhere new, which is what the first half of the movie is signaling. Marvel's mantra has always been,
"The world right outside our window."
And the MCU could have brought some of that realism into their films by holding their character accountable. Instead, they give in to their base emotions.
It's my fault.
That's not true.
You turn the TV back on. They're being very specific.
In the book, both Tony and Steve were right, in their own way. They had opposing views that were both interlaced into a vibrant political allegory. In the movie, both Tony and Steve fall prey to their lesser demons, and are wrong. Steve is blinded by his love for Bucky and is caught in a betrayal of Tony. Instead of taking the high road and turning Bucky over to the authorities, Tony chooses revenge. And therein lies the biggest problem with Civil War as a movie. It accomplished so much and plays out so many threads so expertly, you basically forget what the movie should be about. Civil War is the first time that Marvel opted to stagnate the development of their world over the quick and easy progress of the characters. This is evidenced by how quickly the Sokovia Accords stopped mattering in the greater MCU.
Making suits exclusively for superheroes necessitates anonymity. May I remind you that the Sokovia Accords have been repealed.
Ultimately, Captain America: Civil War is a fantastic superhero film. However, it could have been so much more than that. Civil War's ambitions are to make a great film about superheroes punching one another, and it does that flawlessly. But it could have been a great superhero film about how we progress sociologically and how, in the face of near godlike abilities, it's very hard to remain true to our collective conviction.
Come on, get your stuff. Let's go.
That's from Sony's forthcoming Madam Web movie. And if the guy she's fighting reminds you of Spiderman, we're pretty sure that's exactly what they were going for, because since his appearance in 2016 Civil War, both Marvel and Sony have increasingly been propping up their cinematic superhero offerings on the back of the famous web slinger. With all signs indicating things will get worse before they get better, it has to make fans wonder, how many cinematic universes can Spider-Man save?
I don't want to brag, but I will.
I was in the Avengers. The Avengers?
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. What is that?
When Peter Parker's friendly neighborhood Spider-Man swung onto the screen in Civil War, it was a truly amazing moment.
You're the Spiderling, crime-fighting spider. You're Spider-Boy?
Spider-Man.
Not in that onesie, you're not.
Licensed to Sony, who produced the Spider-Man films that starred Toby Maguire and Andrew Garfield, the fan-favorite character had always been forced to exist in a world of his own. But due to Sony's mismanagement of the character, Marvel was able to convince them to allow the wall crawler to finally appear on the big screen with his fellow Marvel superheroes. Now, in 2016, the MCU wasn't exactly in need of saving, but it's easy to speculate that the slightly disappointing Avengers: Age of Ultron had the studio concerned it might be losing the fans' attention. So even though Civil War introduced cool new characters like Black Panther and had the entire Avengers cast, it was the arrival of Spider-Man that was prominently featured in the trailer's closing moments, a spot often reserved for the most tantalizing marketing image. Played by Tom Holland, the MCU's Spider-Man was instantly beloved by fans.
You got hard, kid. Where you from?
Queens.
Brooklyn.
And would quickly reappear in 2017's Spider-Man: Homecoming. His first solo movie would be a small-stakes adventure that found the high schooler trying to stop the Vulture from stealing technology from Tony Stark. The movie was well received by mass audiences and critics, making over $880 million worldwide.
Actually, it turns out it was the perfect sort of tough love moment that you needed, right? To urge you on, right? Wouldn't you think? Don't you think? Let's just say it was.
Spider-Man would return in 2018's Avengers: Infinity War, fighting alongside Iron Man and Doctor Strange on an adventure that would take him into space and put him right into the heart of the battle. Fans were devastated when Thanos snapped Peter and half of the universe out of existence. Having been dusted by Thanos, Peter didn't get much screen time in Avengers: Endgame, but when he finally did show up, his resurrection turned out to be one of the movie's biggest cheer-out-loud moments.
Do you remember when we were in space? And I got all dusty, but Doctor Strange was there, right? And then he started doing the yellow sparkly thing that he does all the time. What are you doing?
In the wake of the Infinity Saga, fans watched to see what Marvel would do next. The two previous Avengers outings had been followed by light, comedic Ant-Man films designed to act as palate cleansers after the massive event movies. But possibly concerned people would tune out after the conclusion of the decade-long storyline, not to mention the death of Iron Man.
Pray nothing crazy happens again, because are the Avengers even like a thing anymore? Does anyone even have a plan?
I have a plan.
Marvel decided to follow Endgame with the biggest attraction they had left, Spider-Man. Like Homecoming, 2019's Spider-Man: Far From Home was a small-stakes story that found Peter battling a supervillain over technology made by Tony Stark, who, even in death, managed to be at the center of the story. Doubling as something of a low-key coda to Endgame, the movie's plot didn't tell fans much about what to expect from the MCU's next phase. The film's arrival felt rushed and poorly planned from a universe-building perspective. It did, however, keep them coming back to theaters. It was a smash with critics and audiences, grossing over $1.1 billion worldwide, but at what cost? Did Marvel really think we would move on from Endgame so quickly?
The whole world is asking who's going to be the next Iron Man. I don't know if that's me happy. I'm not Iron Man.
Most recently, Holland donned the red and blues for 2021's Spider-Man: No Way Home. As the fourth film in MCU Phase 5, No Way Home followed 3 movies that all featured either less or totally unproven commodities. Black Widow had never headlined her own movie before, while Shang-Chi and Eternals both featured completely new heroes. The scheduling suggests that, once again, Marvel was counting on Spidey to revive their fortunes if interest flagged, and though the reasons for it are complicated, all 3 did have relatively lower box office returns. Meanwhile, the movie itself tripled down on the audience's goodwill for Spidey by bringing back Maguire and Garfield, each playing their own respective Spider-Man.
Whoa! That came out of you.
Yeah. You can't do that, huh?
No?
How on earth does that even?
Anyway, we're getting sidetracked.
At the same time, however, No Way Home seemed in some ways to be almost too beholden to fan culture. The popular meme of 2 Spider-Men pointing at each other was referenced in the movie and its marketing.
Peter!
Yeah? Oh, sorry. Did you mean
that? Peter.
We're all calling Peter.
Peter Parker?
Same.
Nonetheless, the threequel was a huge hit with audiences and critics. 6 cinematic appearances in 6 years is a lot for any superhero, especially one who had already appeared in 5 solo films before he ever showed up in the MCU. But thanks to the unique rights-sharing agreement between Sony and Marvel, Hollywood still wasn't about to let Peter Parker rest. He played a feature role in 2019's animated feature Into the Spider-Verse, as well as its 2023 sequel Across the Spider-Verse. He's also almost certain to return in its forthcoming sequel, Beyond the Spider-Verse.
We're a little team. Me as the teacher who could still do it. You as the student who can do it, just not as good.
At the same time, Sony has taken it upon themselves to create a cinematic universe built out of Spider-Man villains and supporting characters. These movies include Venom and its sequel, Morbius, and forthcoming Kraven, and the aforementioned Madam Web. While Venom and its sequel were both, to varying extents, box office successes, Morbius was a major flop, and the cinematic fates of Madam Web and Kraven still to be determined. It seems that, like Marvel, Sony is going back to the Spider-Man well. Despite a brief multiverse-based tease of Holland's image in Venom 2's post-credit scene, and an equally brief appearance by Tom Hardy's Eddie Brock at the end of No Way Home, Spidey himself has never actually appeared in the Sony Spider-Man villain universe. But it is now seemingly increasingly likely that that status quo is about to change.
Maybe I should go to New York and speak to this, Spider-Man.
By the way, if you're averse to hearing a fan theory that may spoil aspects of the plot of Madam Web, you might want to save this video now and check out the rest later.
Oh my God! This isn't what it looks like, Happy.
For everyone else, a leaked set photo has shown Emma Roberts, who is confirmed to be playing Peter Parker's mother, Mary, made up to appear pregnant. This has led many fans and commentators to speculate that Madam Web is laying the groundwork for the introduction of yet another version of Peter Parker, who will inhabit the universe depicted in the Sony films. It's a move many have long expected the studio to make, as their films do seem to tease the existence of the hero in their universe, and with television projects focusing on characters like Silk and Spider-Man Noir already in development, the franchise is badly in need of something to juice fans' interest.
What the hell is that? Everyone's got a gimmick now.
Spider-Man and his supporting cast are not going to be able to carry multiple movie franchises in live action and another in animation for two different studios in perpetuity. It's simple, true believer. The more Spider movies they make, the worse they'll become. Or in other words, the more cinematic universes Spidey is asked to save, the higher the likelihood that he will eventually fail them all.